Picture this, a continent of stone and shadow, where torches flicker in cathedral halls and night stretches endless over thousands of villages scattered across an entire continent spanning centuries of conflict. Medieval Europe wasn't the simple, faith-bound world that history textbooks present to us today. Beneath the carefully maintained surface of official Christendom, the Mass, the sacraments, the doctrine enforced from Rome, existed something far more intricate. A spiritual landscape so complex, so layered with competing beliefs and hidden practices, that the Church itself found it nearly impossible to control. This is where our story begins, not in the light of official history, but in the shadowed spaces between, where fragments of something crucial still echo across the centuries. The Church didn't simply replace all older beliefs overnight. What happened was far more complicated than that. For centuries, local traditions persisted alongside Christianity. Harvest rituals blessed under Christ's name, yet conducted according to practices that predated his birth. Seasonal ceremonies honoring the turning of the year in ways Rome had explicitly forbidden. People lived in two spiritual worlds at once, weaving together what was sanctioned from above with what had been whispered down through generations. Most clergy tolerated this arrangement, even participated in it. They understood something crucial. You cannot erase thousands of years of human practice by declaring it heretical. People hold on to what gives their lives meaning, especially when that meaning runs deeper than any institution's authority. But something shifted. Around the 11th century, the Church began to tighten its grip with renewed force and determination. This wasn't random cruelty motivated by simple dogmatism. Rome was threatened. The schism with the Eastern Orthodox Church had fractured Christian unity. Islamic expansion was pressing against European borders. Heretical movements like the Cathars were spreading across southern France, offering ordinary people alternatives to institutional religion. They were losing control. The Church realized its monopoly on spiritual authority was fracturing. The response was calculated and merciless: uniformity or eternal damnation. No more tolerance for local variations. No more blending of old and new. Practices that had been quietly overlooked for generations were suddenly declared forbidden, heretical, worthy of prosecution. Here lies a profound irony historians have only recently articulated. The more the Church tried to suppress these practices, the more evidence of them surfaced. Why? Because suppression always leaves traces. When you hunt something systematically, you leave records of the hunt. When you burn texts you deem dangerous, you create documentation of what was burned. When you prosecute people for forbidden rituals, interrogation records survive. Confessions detail the very practices Rome wanted erased. Architectural features within cathedrals and monasteries begin to make sense only when interpreted through hidden ceremonies. Fragmentary manuscripts, marginal notes in religious texts, coded language in theological commentaries, all form a shadow history, contradicting the official narrative. This paradox is what makes the story extraordinary. The Church constructed a firewall of silence, yet couldn't prevent cracks from appearing. The more determined the suppression became, the more elaborate the evidence emerged. It's as though history itself was leaving breadcrumbs, defying the institution's relentless attempt to impose complete amnesia on the historical record. Consider what this means. Everything you've learned about medieval Christianity might be fundamentally incomplete. There exists an entire layer of human experience, spiritual, communal, transformative, that was deliberately scrubbed from the official record, not lost by accident, deliberately erased, and yet, paradoxically, not entirely successfully. We're going to investigate this centuries-old cover-up together, piece by piece. To understand what was so threatening that institutional power descended upon it with such violence, we must first understand the world in which these rituals thrived. A world where the spiritual and political were absolutely inseparable, where power and authority were maintained through carefully guarded secrets, whispered only to the initiated few. Let us step back slowly now into that shadowed landscape, into a distant time before the Church's greatest erasure began. Medieval Europe wasn't a place of singular faith. This is crucial to understand. Walk into any village during this period, and you encountered a peculiar spiritual arrangement that historians have struggled properly to describe. On Sunday morning, The peasant attended Mass. The priest stood before the congregation in vestments blessed by Rome itself, speaking Latin most couldn't comprehend, performing sacraments that connected them to institutional Christianity, spanning from the Atlantic to Constantinople. The bells rang. The bread became Christ. The community knelt in unison. This was official spirituality, mediated, hierarchical, unified under distant papal authority. But spirituality extended far beyond that Sunday hour. Look closer at how people actually lived, and something emerges that the Church would later desperately try to suppress. The persistence of older practices, woven seamlessly into ordinary existence. When harvest season arrived, families observed ceremonies timed to celestial events, practices their ancestors had conducted for generations before any church existed. These ceremonies now used Christian language. Christ was invoked, the Virgin was mentioned, yet the structure, the timing, the essential purpose remained untouched by institutional Christianity. The priest's blessing simply gave it permission to continue. This arrangement wasn't unusual or heretical in the early medieval centuries. It was normal. It was practical. Local priests understood something the distant hierarchy in Rome seemed to overlook. You cannot suppress what genuinely sustains people. A peasant woman who learned from her mother the precise moment to plant seeds according to certain stars didn't experience this knowledge as heretical. She experienced it as survival, as accumulated wisdom passed down through generations. When the priest blessed her planting ceremony, using Christian terminology, while she performed the ancient ritual, both parties understood an unspoken arrangement. The old ways continue, but now they exist within Christian permission. The same applied to healing practices, to seasonal gatherings, to rites marking life transitions. A child wasn't simply baptized into Christianity. The ceremony incorporated local protective practices, symbolic elements from traditions predating the church itself. A marriage ceremony involved church vows, but also elements of older fertility rites conducted under different names. A death involved last rites from the priest, but also older practices ensuring the soul's proper passage beyond. These weren't corruptions of Christianity. They were natural human accommodations between two spiritual systems, occupying identical cultural spaces. Most local priests participated willingly, often with genuine theological justification. They believed they were Christianizing older practices, transforming them through the Church's authority. They didn't see themselves as heretics. They were practical administrators of spiritual life in communities they served. Rome tolerated this arrangement for centuries because controlling thousands of local variations seemed impossible. Attempting enforcement would have been economically ruinous and practically unfeasible. Better to allow accommodation than trigger rebellion. But this acceptance represented something Rome couldn't ultimately permit. It represented distributed spiritual authority. It meant people experienced the sacred through channels the Church didn't control. It suggested that meaning could exist outside institutional mediation. It implied that the priest wasn't absolutely necessary for accessing the divine. And as circumstances changed, as threats to church authority multiplied from every direction, Rome began reconsidering tolerance. The question wasn't whether these practices existed, everyone knew they did. The question was whether the Church would continue permitting them. As these layered spiritual practices deepened and multiplied across the medieval world, the Church found itself confronting an unexpected crisis. Its own authority was being quietly undermined by forces it couldn't control through conventional means. Everything changed around the year 1050. Not suddenly, but with the force of deliberate institutional will applied relentlessly across centuries. Rome looked around and saw something that terrified its leadership. The monopoly on spiritual authority was crumbling from multiple directions simultaneously. From the east came the Great Schism of 1054, the final split between Roman Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity that shattered the illusion of unified Christendom, stretching across continents and cultures. From the south, Islamic forces pressed relentlessly against European borders with military conquest. From within European territories themselves, new voices emerged, challenging Rome's absolute monopoly on salvation itself. The Cathars offered alternative spirituality to the oppressed poor of southern France, suggesting paths to the divine without institutional mediation. Waldensian movements whispered that direct connection to God was possible without priestly intermediaries. Mystical movements within the Church itself emphasized personal spiritual experience over institutional doctrine and hierarchical authority. Rome was losing control, and every passing year confirmed this terrifying reality. The response was calculated, merciless, and comprehensive. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, a systematic series of councils and papal edicts transformed church policy from mere accommodation to iron-fisted uniformity. No longer would Rome tolerate regional spiritual variations and local accommodations that had sustained communities for generations. No longer would priests be permitted to bless practices that, however Christianized in appearance and language, maintained obvious pre-Christian elements and cosmologies. The shift wasn't primarily about fighting heresy, born from outright rejection of Christianity. It was fundamentally about consolidating absolute power over how Christianity itself would be practiced. It wasn't enough for believers to hold correct doctrine privately. People must practice identically everywhere, according to formulas approved exclusively in Rome. Key figures emerged as instruments of this transformation. Pope Gregory VII demanded absolute obedience from clergy, establishing that church law superseded even secular authority, a revolutionary claim that fundamentally altered power dynamics across Europe. Subsequent popes intensified this pressure systematically. Councils like the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 mandated unprecedented uniformity in practices across all territories under church influence. Confession became mandatory rather than optional. The Mass became rigidly standardized. Local variations suddenly became suspect, potentially heretical. Most crucially, the practices that had coexisted peacefully with Christianity for centuries, maintaining their essential nature while adopting Christian language, were suddenly declared forbidden, heretical, worthy of investigation and prosecution. Here lies an extraordinary institutional miscalculation that shaped everything following. The Church believed prohibition alone would erase these practices from existence. This reveals something fundamental about how centralized authority operates. Institutions typically assume declaring something forbidden will eliminate it completely. History suggests the opposite. By transforming tolerated practices into strictly forbidden ones, the Church paradoxically made them far more appealing to those resisting centralized control. Prohibition creates transgression. Transgression carries symbolic power. The rituals that had once seemed like practical accommodations between competing spiritual systems now became powerful symbols of resistance against institutional oppression. The monasteries became something entirely unexpected. These institutions, created to preserve Orthodox Christianity and enforce papal authority, evolved into repositories for the very practices Rome wanted erased. Why would monks risk so much? Because monks possessed literacy in an overwhelmingly illiterate age. They had access to ancient manuscripts, pre-Christian texts, esoteric knowledge preserved through centuries. As persecution intensified outside monastery walls, monks made deliberate choices to preserve forbidden knowledge within them. Some participated in practices themselves. Others recognized that destroying knowledge contradicted their vocation as keepers of learning. They preserved what Rome wanted forgotten. The institutional crackdown was thorough and systematic, yet it produced an irony echoing through centuries. In attempting to erase these practices, Rome inadvertently made them immortal. The machinery of persecution, interrogations documenting practices, confessions, detailing ceremonies, investigations, creating written records, became the primary source for understanding what was hunted. Rome created the evidence against its own erasure. To understand what the Church found so threatening, we must trace these practices backward through time itself. Most people imagine forbidden medieval rituals as innovations, something invented in the 12th century by heretical groups deliberately rejecting Christian doctrine. The reality is far more fascinating and far more ancient. What Rome tried to eliminate wasn't something new. It was something desperately old, something that had sustained human communities for thousands of years before Christianity even existed, and something that Christianity never quite managed to replace. Start in ancient Egypt, where priest-initiated communities gathered in temple chambers to experience direct communion with divine forces. Similar structures appear simultaneously in Mesopotamia, where mystery schools transmitted knowledge through carefully controlled initiation processes. Move forward to classical Greece, where the Eleusinian mysteries attracted initiates from across the Mediterranean world. People willing to travel for weeks to participate in ceremonies promising direct spiritual transformation. These weren't superstitions or entertainment. They addressed something fundamental in human consciousness: the hunger for transcendent experience, for knowledge beyond the mundane, for spiritual transformation that felt authentically real. These practices worked in the human psyche. They created experiences people remembered for the rest of their lives. They bonded communities through shared secrets and shared transformation. Now observe what happened when Christianity spread across Europe. Rather than completely replacing these practices, Christianity encountered them and adapted. The new religion inherited structures, language, and concepts from the traditions it displaced. The Christian sacraments, baptism, communion, confirmation, mirror the structure of initiation ceremonies that predated Christ by centuries. The idea of sacred transformation through ritual participation connects directly to pagan mystery religions. Christian mystical theology, particularly in its most esoteric forms, speaks of direct communion with the divine through experience and vision rather than doctrine alone. This wasn't heresy. This was continuity. The human drive toward these practices was so fundamental that Christianity itself incorporated them, simply using different language and theological frameworks. But something crucial persisted beneath the Christian surface. In villages throughout medieval Europe, practices continued that maintained their essential ancient character despite Christian language. Fertility ceremonies timed to celestial events, these weren't corruptions of Christianity, but preservation of practices addressing the fundamental human need to participate in seasonal cycles and cosmic patterns. Initiation rites that involved symbolic death and rebirth, ecstatic states achieved through specific techniques, astronomical observations suggesting knowledge of the heavens' movements. All of these appeared in medieval contexts, but carried lineages extending back through centuries of unbroken practice. The evidence for this deep history appears throughout surviving texts. Marginalia, in illuminated manuscripts from Benedictine monasteries, describe practices in coded language that scholars have only recently learned to decipher. References appear in monastic chronicles to certain ceremonies conducted on specific dates. Ceremonies that make sense only when recognized as ancient seasonal rituals wearing Christian disguises. Architectural features within specific cathedrals align with celestial events in ways that serve no purpose within Christian theology, but make perfect sense within cosmological frameworks predating Christianity by millennia. These buildings weren't constructed by accident. Their orientations, their internal geometries, their hidden chambers all suggest knowledge and intention focused on practices Rome wanted forgotten. Consider the evidence from preserved manuscripts attributed to Benedictine and Cistercian communities. Texts exist describing ritual practices through alchemical language, botanical terminology, and astronomical references. The Munich Manual, fragments of the Picatrix, and various grimoires preserved in medieval libraries contain instructions that historians now recognize as descriptions of genuine ritual practices conducted across centuries. Not fantasies, not inventions, actual ceremonies performed by real communities, addressing real spiritual needs. The crucial realization is this: the forbidden rituals didn't emerge from some momentary heretical impulse in the 12th century. They emerged from the deepest wells of human consciousness practices that had sustained communities for thousands of years before Christianity arrived, practices addressing spiritual hungers that seem universal across cultures and centuries. The Church didn't try to erase something new or perverse. It tried to erase something that refused fundamentally to die. Something woven so deeply into human nature that eliminating it required centuries of systematic persecution. The institutions most dedicated to enforcing church orthodoxy became, paradoxically, the primary repositories for the very knowledge Rome wanted erased. This wasn't accidental or coincidental. Understanding why requires examining what monasteries actually were and what monks understood as their fundamental responsibility. These communities weren't simply places where people retreated from the world to pray. They were centers of learning, scholarship, and preservation. Monks were scribes copying texts by candlelight, scholars translating ancient languages, keepers of libraries containing knowledge spanning centuries and civilizations. They preserved not only Christian writings, but vast collections of classical texts, pagan philosophy, pre-Christian wisdom, and esoteric knowledge, precisely because they believed all genuine knowledge potentially revealed divine truth. The monastic vocation created a peculiar psychological space. Monks took vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity, yet their intellectual work demanded independence of thought and judgment. They studied theology intensively, which meant encountering ideas and traditions predating or existing outside Christian frameworks. The most learned monks understood that understanding Christianity required understanding what came before it, what it displaced, what it incorporated. More importantly, many abbots and abbesses came from noble families who maintained their own traditions of esoteric knowledge. These abbots didn't abandon their family heritage upon entering monasteries. They brought it with them, sometimes transmitting it within monastic communities, sometimes participating in practices their public positions formally required them to condemn. Geographic isolation intensified this dynamic. Remote monasteries in mountainous regions or dense forests existed at the edges of church jurisdiction. Communication from Rome arrived slowly, enforcement occurred sporadically, and the abbots possessed substantial autonomy in how they administered their communities. This created space, literal, geographic, institutional space, where forbidden practices could continue with substantially less scrutiny than in towns or parishes under direct episcopal control. Certain Benedictine houses in Germany, specific Cistercian communities in alpine regions, and monastic communities across isolated territories maintained practices that would have triggered immediate prosecution in populated areas. The physical distance from Rome's enforcing mechanisms created refuges where alternative spirituality could persist. The specific evidence is remarkable. Monastic libraries across Europe contain grimoires and ritual texts preserved through ingenious concealment strategies. Instructions for forbidden ceremonies appear encoded within legitimate theological commentaries, decipherable only to readers possessing keys to the coding systems. Marginalia, in illuminated manuscripts, those small notes written in manuscript margins, contain references to practices described in language deliberately obscure to casual readers. Entire texts exist that appear to address purely theological subjects on their surface, but communicate detailed ritual knowledge to initiated readers. It's as though monks conducted entire conversations across centuries, creating a secret archive of forbidden knowledge hidden within the legitimate scholarly record. What motivated this preservation? Some monks participated in these practices themselves, believing they accessed spiritual realities that official Christianity obscured. Others simply held that destroying knowledge contradicted their vocation as keepers of learning. Still others recognized that certain practices addressed human spiritual needs that institutional Christianity failed to meet, and they believed preserving these traditions served genuine spiritual purposes. This wasn't rebellion in the dramatic sense. It was a different understanding of what spiritual duty demanded. A monk copying a forbidden text wasn't necessarily defying church authority. He might genuinely believe he was preserving something sacred, something that shouldn't disappear from human experience, something worth protecting, even at tremendous personal risk. The tension was real and constant. Individual monks navigating between their vows of obedience and their conviction that certain knowledge deserved preservation faced genuine moral complexity. Many lived their entire lives caught between these competing demands. Some eventually confessed their participation in forbidden practices and faced severe punishment. Others maintained their secrets until death. All recognized they were making choices that could result in prosecution, excommunication, or execution if discovered. Yet they persisted. They preserved. They passed knowledge forward through careful channels, through coded texts, through oral transmission among trusted monks, through architectural arrangements encoding symbolic information. The monasteries became archives of the forbidden, precisely because monks understood themselves as having duties to preservation that transcended institutional obedience. The evidence exists, not in grand declarations or obvious testimonies, but hidden in plain sight, encoded within texts that survived specifically because they disguised themselves as something harmless. This is where the investigation becomes genuinely fascinating. Historians over the past 2 centuries have discovered fragments suggesting what forbidden practices actually entailed, how they functioned, what communities believed about them. The puzzle pieces don't form a complete picture, but the edges align in ways too consistent to be coincidental. Start with the coded languages. Monks and practitioners developed elaborate systems for discussing forbidden practices without using explicit terminology that would immediately condemn the texts to destruction. Botanical language became code for herbal practices. Specific plants, referenced in seemingly innocent agricultural texts, actually indicated substances used in ritual contexts to achieve altered consciousness. Astronomical terminology served similar purposes. Descriptions of celestial observations encoded instructions for ceremonies timed to specific planetary configurations or stellar events. Alchemical language was particularly effective. Texts discussing the transformation of base metals into gold simultaneously described spiritual transformation through ritual practice. A skilled reader possessing knowledge of these codes could extract detailed instructions from texts that appeared to ecclesiastical authorities as legitimate scholarly work. The Munich Manual exemplifies this strategy. Discovered in medieval archives, the manuscript discusses various subjects in seemingly innocuous language. Yet close analysis reveals that entire passages describing ritual procedures are disguised within discussions of religious philosophy. Similar patterns appear throughout preserved Cistercian and Benedictine manuscripts. Marginal notes in illuminated biblical commentaries contain references to practices described in language deliberately obscure to untrained readers. The Picatrix, a medieval text on astrological magic preserved through monastic libraries, contains instructions for rituals and cosmological procedures that scholars have only recently begun fully deciphering. More provocatively, certain categories of texts disappeared completely from European libraries with suspicious speed. Grimoires texts, explicitly devoted to ritual instruction, vanished from circulation at rates suggesting deliberate destruction rather than accidental loss. The Inquisition maintained detailed records of book burnings, and grimoires appear disproportionately in these records. The Church understood something crucial. Texts represent threats to institutional authority, because texts can be copied, preserved, transmitted across generations. Individuals can be intimidated or executed. Ideas embedded in texts survive their creators' deaths. The Church prioritized destroying textual evidence of forbidden practices above almost every other category of heretical material. Why? Because texts made these practices teachable, transmissible, potentially recoverable, even after persecution supposedly eliminated them. Yet fragments survived. Trial records provide unexpected corroboration. When the Inquisition prosecuted accused heretics or witches, interrogation records documented defendants describing ritual practices. Some descriptions were extracted under torture, raising questions about reliability. Yet certain details appear consistently across multiple trial records from different regions and time periods. The same ritual structures described in fragmentary manuscripts appear again in testimony from accused practitioners separated by geography and decades. This consistency strengthens the historical reliability of these accounts. The accused weren't simply inventing descriptions to satisfy interrogators' expectations. They were describing practices with recognizable patterns, suggesting genuine, continuous traditions. Consider what this consistency reveals. Similar ceremonies appear documented from different regions. Initiation rituals involving symbolic death and rebirth. Astronomical observances conducted on specific celestial dates. Ecstatic practices using specific techniques. Ceremonies involving transformation of consciousness. The repetition across independent sources suggests these weren't isolated aberrations, but organized traditions with recognizable structures and consistent purposes. Yet we must acknowledge what remains unknowable. The texts that were completely destroyed leave permanent gaps in our understanding. We don't know entire categories of practices that disappeared without surviving any documentary evidence. We can infer their existence from absences from the intensity of the Church's efforts to eliminate them, from scattered references to texts we've never recovered, but we cannot fully reconstruct them. This absence itself constitutes evidence. The fact that specific types of texts vanished completely, while others survived, suggests the Church recognized certain practices as particularly threatening. There exists a possibility that historians have only recently begun taking seriously, and it fundamentally changes how we understand medieval Christianity. What if the Church wasn't simply a monolithic institution unified against forbidden practices? What if, instead, official doctrine and the public hierarchy existed alongside a parallel structure, an invisible network of initiated clergy who understood and performed the very rituals Rome officially condemned? This isn't conspiracy thinking in the crude sense. It's a serious historical hypothesis, supported by fragments of evidence, suggesting something far more complex than simple opposition between an institution and its rebels. Consider the biographical trajectories of certain high-ranking church officials. Many cardinals and bishops came from aristocratic families who maintained their own esoteric traditions, predating Christianity itself. These weren't poor boys educated by the Church who rose through merit. These were sons of nobility, raised within families possessing secret knowledge transmitted across generations, who entered the Church hierarchy while maintaining loyalty to older spiritual traditions. Their positions within the Church didn't erase their family heritage. In some cases, it enhanced their capacity to preserve and transmit that heritage. An abbot from an aristocratic family brought resources, authority, and protection that allowed him to conduct practices that would have been impossible for an ordinary monk. The concept of esoteric versus exoteric Christianity provides intellectual scaffolding for understanding this possibility. Esoteric knowledge is knowledge taught only to initiates, requiring preparation and trustworthiness to receive. Exoteric knowledge is what's taught to the masses, simplified and adapted for general understanding. Many religious traditions maintain this division. Christianity itself contains this element. Early Christian mysticism emphasized direct experience of the divine through contemplation and spiritual practice, available only to those with time and training to pursue it. Ordinary believers received simplified doctrine focused on faith and obedience. What if certain clergy maintained and transmitted esoteric Christianity, a deeper, more mysterious version, emphasizing direct experience and forbidden knowledge within private circles while teaching exoteric Christianity publicly? Evidence suggests exactly this pattern. Certain bishops and cardinals preserved and transmitted forbidden knowledge through personal instruction rather than written texts. They chose successors carefully, initiating them gradually into deeper teachings after demonstrating trustworthiness. This created lineages of initiated clergy that functioned alongside the official institutional hierarchy, transmitting knowledge through channels Rome couldn't easily detect or suppress. A cardinal teaching a younger cleric theology publicly might simultaneously transmit entirely different teachings privately. The younger man would eventually become a bishop, continuing the transmission to his chosen successors. Specific historical figures embody this possibility. Nicholas of Cusa, a 15th century cardinal, expressed ideas about the unity of all religions and the limitations of rational theology that suggest engagement with esoteric traditions. Giordano Bruno, Bruno's spiritual successor in various ways, openly discussed cosmologies and spiritualities that contradicted official doctrine while maintaining positions that should have resulted in immediate prosecution. Various Renaissance cardinals expressed heterodox ideas about astrology, alchemy, and spiritual transformation that suggest participation in traditions officially condemned as heretical. Were these men rebels, attempting to reform an institution from within? Or were they representatives of an alternative tradition that had survived hidden within Christianity's structures since its very beginning? The question remains deliberately unresolved because the evidence permits multiple interpretations. We possess fragments suggesting something organized and continuous, yet not enough documentation to definitively prove the structure's extent or nature. This ambiguity itself is significant. If these networks were genuinely sophisticated, we'd expect limited documentary evidence. Effective secrecy leaves few traces. The very scarcity of evidence might paradoxically confirm the existence of systems designed precisely to avoid leaving evidence. What emerges from careful examination is not clear proof of a hidden church within the church. but rather serious indication of something more complex than simple binary opposition between institutional authority and forbidden practice. The church contained multitudes. It held contradictions. Some of its highest officials may have simultaneously served as guardians of knowledge, the institution officially hunted. If such a structure existed, it would require specific mechanisms for recruitment, initiation, and communication systems capable of evading detection by the very institution they inhabited. How did individuals gain access to such networks? What pathways existed for initiating people into forbidden knowledge while maintaining absolute secrecy? There was no single pathway into participation. Instead, multiple routes led different people into forbidden knowledge and ritual communities, each adapted to specific circumstances and social positions. Understanding these pathways illuminates how dangerous practices survived centuries of systematic persecution. Monastic communities offered one route. A young man entered a monastery as a novice, motivated by genuine faith or family pressure, or seeking shelter from the world's harshness. He spent months or years performing basic duties, observing other monks, gradually proving his trustworthiness and discretion. Older monks noticed him. A trusted elder might begin hinting that deeper teachings existed beyond the official theology taught in the scriptorium. After years of careful observation, perhaps a senior monk would invite the novice to participate in a gathering beyond official knowledge. Not all monks underwent this process. Most never learned that their monastery harbored hidden practices. But those selected, those deemed sufficiently trustworthy and spiritually prepared, gradually became aware that their community maintained traditions Rome believed it had successfully suppressed. Aristocratic families transmitted knowledge through different channels. A noble child grew up hearing hints of family traditions, learning oblique references to practices conducted in private chapels. Parents and elder relatives would gradually reveal more, testing commitment and discretion. By adulthood, the young noble might participate actively in rituals conducted on family estates. When such a person later entered the church hierarchy, a common path for noble sons, they carried this knowledge with them, sometimes initiating carefully selected colleagues into alternative understandings of spirituality that official doctrine denied. Chance encounters offered another pathway. A priest serving in a parish might encounter strangers in unusual circumstances, conversations suggesting knowledge beyond official teaching. These initial contacts might develop into cautious friendships, gradually deepening as trust increased. Eventually, if both parties remained convinced of the other's discretion and spiritual commitment, explicit invitations might occur. Participation in forbidden rituals represented an enormous risk. Social death awaited those exposed. Excommunication was merely the beginning. Inquisitorial prosecution meant torture, forced confession, execution. Yet people accepted these risks willingly. Why? The answer reveals something crucial about the spiritual landscape of medieval Christianity. Official church teaching failed to address certain profound human needs. Direct mystical experience of the divine, communion beyond institutional mediation, knowledge of hidden cosmologies, suggesting participation in vast patterns. These weren't available through conventional Christian practice. They were available through forbidden rituals. The experiences offered genuine transformation. Participants reported encounters with realities they understood as profoundly sacred and ultimately real. No threat of execution could eliminate desire for such experience, once genuinely tasted. Initiation itself followed recognizable structures. Oaths of silence, binding initiates to secrecy through sacred vows. Symbolic death and rebirth, where candidates underwent rituals mirroring the transformation of consciousness they would later experience. Tests of courage and commitment, demonstrating that initiates possessed genuine dedication rather than mere curiosity. Revelation of cosmologies contradicting official doctrine, showing initiates that the universe was organized according to principles Rome wanted hidden. The process created powerful bonds between people sharing secrets. Initiation created commitment stronger than ordinary social ties because it involved mutual vulnerability and interdependence. Crucial for survival was compartmentalization. Knowledge about these practices was deliberately fragmented. Most clergy knew nothing about hidden networks. Most nobility didn't participate. Most common people remained entirely unaware. Individuals knew their immediate circles, but the full extent of these networks remained unknown even to most participants. This compartmentalization wasn't accidental. It was deliberate security strategy. If captured and interrogated, a participant could reveal only what they personally knew. They couldn't betray the entire network because they didn't know the entire network's extent. This compartmentalization also explains why these practices persisted despite persecution. The church couldn't identify the full structure to destroy it. It captured fragments while the larger organism persisted. Yet communities required spaces. Isolated individuals might survive, but forbidden rituals demanded gathering places. The spaces existed, not hidden in forests or caves, not in remote catacombs isolated from civilization, but rather in plain sight beneath the holiest places in Christendom. This is the architectural secret that medieval persecution inadvertently preserved. Forbidden gatherings occurred in crypts beneath churches, in monastic refectories during hours when most monks slept, in private chapel spaces within noble estates, in the basements of guild halls, even in cathedral spaces after official services ended and ordinary worshippers departed. Medieval architecture itself became a tool for preservation. Churches and cathedrals constructed during earlier, more tolerant periods sometimes incorporated spaces deliberately designed for purposes beyond official function. Certain chambers possessed unusual acoustic properties. Sounds from these spaces couldn't be heard in adjacent rooms, creating natural soundproofing for secret gatherings. Passages appeared that served no obvious ecclesiastical purpose, yet connected different sections of buildings, facilitating movement during hidden ceremonies. Crypts beneath sanctuaries contained features specific orientations, geometric proportions, symbolic markings that made sense only when interpreted as ritual spaces designed for practices requiring particular physical configurations. These spaces weren't accidents of medieval construction. They reflect knowledge and intention. Medieval builders possessed understanding of sacred geometry, of how physical dimensions and proportions influenced spiritual experience. They built churches according to principles that churches, from an institutional perspective, didn't require. These buildings encoded knowledge. Their very architecture preserved practices within stone and geometry, visible to anyone understanding how to read them. The irony cuts deep. The church built structures designed to eradicate forbidden practices, while those structures simultaneously embodied and preserved them. Why these locations specifically? Proximity to power centers meant access to resources. Hiding practices within already sacred spaces created plausible deniability. If discovered, participants could claim they were simply praying, conducting alternative forms of worship, rather than heretical ceremonies. The spaces already possessed sacred character, which enhanced the experiences occurring within them. Participants gathered in places laden with centuries of ritual use, absorbing the cumulative spiritual resonance these spaces possessed. These networks connected across Europe through distributed knowledge and traveling practitioners. Information moved between monastic communities through carefully concealed correspondence. Practitioners traveled between regions, carrying knowledge and maintaining continuity across geographic distances. A monk might travel to a distant monastery, conducting rituals alongside unfamiliar communities, then return home with deepened knowledge and strengthened conviction. This distributed network proved remarkably resilient. The church could disrupt nodes, but couldn't dismantle the network because it lacked centralized structure. Destroying one community didn't eliminate the entire system. Knowledge, stored in distributed form, preserved in multiple locations, proved harder to eliminate than knowledge concentrated in single repositories. The networks weren't perfect or permanent. Persecution disrupted them. Interrogations revealed connections. Some communities were scattered. Knowledge was lost when communities were destroyed faster than they could transmit their traditions forward. Yet new networks emerged, reformed through different channels, adapted to new circumstances. The fundamental human impulses driving these practices: hunger for direct spiritual experience, conviction that certain knowledge deserved preservation despite institutional opposition, hunger for community based on genuine shared understanding. These impulses proved resilient enough to survive constant pressure. Picture yourself in absolute darkness. Not the darkness of a moonless night where your eyes eventually adjust. Absolute darkness. The kind that exists in underground chambers cut from stone, where no light penetrates from any source. You've been placed here deliberately, separated from everything familiar. The other participants wait elsewhere. You're alone with your fear, your imagination, your consciousness turning inward because there's nothing external to focus on anymore. This is where transformation ceremonies began. Historians reconstructing these experiences from fragmentary evidence, preserved manuscripts, trial records describing what accused practitioners confessed. Comparative analysis with ancient mystery religions have concluded that medieval forbidden rituals followed patterns remarkably similar to initiation ceremonies documented in classical sources. The Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece. Orphic rites, mystery cults throughout the ancient Mediterranean, all involved ritualized death and rebirth experiences. Medieval practitioners appear to have revived or maintained continuity with these ancient traditions, adapting them to medieval Christian contexts while preserving their essential structure and power. Sensory deprivation formed the beginning. Extended periods in darkness, sometimes accompanied by fasting or restricted food intake, altered consciousness in specific ways. The brain, deprived of external stimulation, begins generating internal experiences. Visions appear. The boundary between imagination and perception blurs. Time becomes meaningless. In this altered state, guides would lead the initiate through symbolic experiences of death. The initiate might be ritually killed, laid in a tomb-like chamber, left in darkness and isolation, experiencing genuine terror. This wasn't theatrical performance. The psychological intensity was real. Hearts raced. Breathing became difficult. Some initiates genuinely believed they were dying. Then, after hours or sometimes days, came the reversal. Light appeared. The initiate was brought back into the community, reborn into a transformed state. The experience of surviving death, of confronting the dissolution of self and returning, created genuine alteration in consciousness and self-perception. Participants emerged from such ceremonies fundamentally changed. Their sense of identity had been shattered and reformed. Death had been encountered and survived. The experience felt utterly real, regardless of how modern observers might interpret it. Evidence suggests some ceremonies incorporated psychoactive substances. Ergot poisoning, caused by fungi in medieval rye, produces effects remarkably similar to modern LSD hallucinations. Sense of unity with cosmos, profound spiritual experiences. Medieval practitioners may have deliberately cultivated ergot contamination or used other botanical substances to enhance ritualistic experiences. A person in complete darkness, fasting, already psychologically primed for visionary experience through symbolic death ceremonies, then given substances inducing hallucinations and altered consciousness, would experience something genuinely overwhelming. The visions felt absolutely real. They weren't flights of fancy, they were encounters with something perceived as divine, cosmic, ultimately real. What drew people to accept such intense, dangerous experiences? The answer lies in what these practices offered that official Christianity didn't. Direct communion with the sacred, not mediated through priests or sacraments, knowledge of hidden truths about the cosmos and human nature that official theology obscured. Personal transformation through authentic encounter with something ultimate and real. The experiences felt like genuine awakening to realities most people remained asleep to. The theological framework participants constructed around these practices emphasized deepening relationship with the divine through direct experience rather than faith in doctrine. They believed themselves accessing ancient wisdom that institutional Christianity had lost or deliberately suppressed. They conceived of themselves as inheritors of mysteries and initiatory traditions, stretching back through early Christian mysticism to pre-Christian times. The Church's official teaching about sin and redemption seemed to them incomplete, missing the deeper spiritual dimensions available to those willing to undergo transformation. Risks were genuine. The psychological intensity of these experiences could cause lasting harm. Initiation leaders sometimes manipulated participants, using people's vulnerability during altered consciousness states for exploitation or abuse. The social dangers were severe. Discovery meant excommunication, prosecution, execution. Yet for those experiencing these ceremonies, the transformative power seemed to justify the risks. They had encountered something real. They had been reborn. They had experienced the sacred directly. Nothing the church threatened could eliminate that experience from memory. This is precisely why the church found these practices so threatening. They bypassed clerical authority entirely. They proved to participants that spiritual transformation didn't require institutional mediation. They offered alternative paths to the sacred that rendered priests unnecessary. Clerical authority depends on controlling access to the divine. Forbidden rituals demonstrated that direct access was possible without clerical permission. Yet individual transformation, profound as it was, existed within larger communal contexts. The rituals weren't merely individual experiences. They functioned within communities. When people gathered in candlelit crypts or hidden chambers, they weren't simply pursuing personal spiritual advancement. They were constructing alternative social reality. This communal dimension explains why the church pursued these practices with such ruthlessness, and why they persisted despite overwhelming institutional pressure. Consider what happened when communities gathered. Sometimes small groups of 5 or 10 people, sometimes larger assemblies of dozens. In these gatherings, the normal social hierarchies governing medieval life temporarily inverted. Masters stood alongside servants as equals. Nobility participated without privileged position. Women held authority within the rituals themselves, speaking with power and leading ceremonies. Common people encountered the sacred directly, without requiring priestly intermediaries. These weren't abstract ideals. They were lived realities, experienced within specific ceremonies. Someone who spent ordinary life in rigid social subordination, suddenly permitted to speak with authority and participate equally in sacred community, experienced genuine liberation. Trial records reveal that some forbidden communities explicitly rejected social hierarchy. Testimonies suggest participants conceived of themselves as living out the primitive Christian ideal that the institutional church had betrayed. In Scripture, the early church had practiced radical equality, common property, women exercising spiritual authority. Medieval forbidden communities attempted to recover this earlier vision. They understood themselves as prophetic remnants, witnessing to authentic Christianity against institutional corruption. Their alternative social arrangements weren't rebellion for rebellion's sake. They were theological claims about what genuine spirituality required. This communal dimension explains persistence far more effectively than individual spiritual hunger alone. The communities functioned as psychological sanctuaries. People lived within oppressive feudal structures with no legitimate outlet for dissent or resistance. Work was compulsory. Social position was fixed from birth. Famine and plague killed arbitrarily. The church reinforced all of this, teaching that suffering was God's will and resistance was sin. Within forbidden communities, people found spaces where oppression could be temporarily escaped, where their voices carried weight, where they were treated with genuine respect, where collective decisions were made through consensus rather than imposed from above. The communities provided genuine social functions that official institutions failed to address. Emotional support and counseling, practical assistance during hardship, spiritual meaning-making in a world that official teaching failed to render coherent, celebration of shared identity and belonging. Someone suffering in isolation found community. Someone broken by grief found witnesses. Someone struggling spiritually found others on similar journeys. These weren't mystical fantasies. They were actual human relationships, meeting genuine needs. The radical equality within forbidden communities particularly threatened institutional order. Feudalism depended on convincing people that hierarchy was natural, divinely ordained, unchangeable. The church reinforced this teaching. Yet forbidden communities demonstrated that different social arrangements were possible. They proved that humans could organize spirituality and community on egalitarian principles. They showed that women could exercise spiritual authority. They provided lived evidence that social hierarchy wasn't inevitable. This represented not merely heresy, but genuine social threat. Trial records from inquisitorial prosecutions reveal that interrogators recognized this social dimension. They didn't prosecute only the theological teachings. They focused particularly on the community's egalitarian structures. the participation of women in leadership, the rejection of clerical authority. The Church understood that these weren't abstract heresies, but organized counter-communities offering real alternatives to both ecclesiastical control and feudal hierarchy. For generations and centuries, these communities maintained their practices in shadows and secret spaces. They attracted successive waves of participants, hungry for authentic spirituality and genuine community. They preserved traditions and transmitted knowledge across generations. They demonstrated that resistance to institutional authority was possible. Then circumstances changed. The Church's inquisitorial apparatus became increasingly sophisticated and organized. The machinery of persecution accelerated. The age of relatively hidden practice was ending. The forbidden rituals possessed another dimension that historians have only recently begun understanding properly. Medieval practitioners didn't simply gather arbitrarily. They gathered according to celestial calendars. They conducted ceremonies timed to specific astronomical events. They organized their spiritual practice around the movements of stars and planets. This wasn't superstition in the sense of mere magical thinking. It reflected a coherent cosmological worldview, where human ritual participation aligned individual and communal consciousness with vast cosmic patterns. Evidence survives, suggesting extensive astronomical knowledge, preservation within forbidden communities. Manuscripts preserved in monasteries contain detailed observations of celestial events alongside descriptions of ritual practices. Specific ceremonies were conducted under particular constellations. Rituals coincided with solstices, equinoxes, and specific planetary configurations that practitioners believed carried spiritual significance. The communities gathered when the cosmos demanded gathering. They performed ceremonies when celestial alignments suggested cosmic participation became possible. This cosmic orientation represented a fundamental departure from official Christianity's theological framework. The Church emphasized historical redemption, Christ's incarnation, and subsequent resurrection as singular historical events that granted salvation to believers. Time was linear, moving toward eventual judgment. The future was fundamentally different from the past. Medieval forbidden practitioners, by contrast, maintained more cyclical understandings of time. They believed in eternal cosmic patterns repeating infinitely. They understood human ritual participation not as attempting to manipulate cosmic forces magically, but rather as sympathetic resonance with larger patterns. When they gathered under specific stars to conduct ceremonies, they believed themselves participating in cosmic processes vaster than individual human will. The philosophical concept underlying this was correspondences, the medieval belief that patterns repeated at different scales of reality. What occurred in human consciousness corresponded to what occurred in the cosmos. What the practitioner experienced spiritually corresponded to celestial events. Ritual participation could align the individual and communal psyche with cosmic forces. The microcosm of human experience could become synchronized with the macrocosm of cosmic reality. This wasn't primitive thinking. It was a sophisticated metaphysical system, attempting to locate human meaning within larger universal patterns. Archaeological evidence and architectural analysis reveal that medieval builders constructed ritual spaces with astronomical precision. Certain cathedrals and hidden ritual chambers align with specific celestial events. Chambers are oriented toward sunrise on particular dates. Geometric proportions encode astronomical relationships. These weren't accidental features. They reflect knowledge and intention. Medieval practitioners understood how to build spaces where geometry, proportion, and orientation created environments, enhancing ritual experience and cosmic attunement. The Church recognized this threat more clearly than many modern historians do. Rome's persecution of these practices wasn't merely theological. It included deliberate suppression of astronomical learning itself. Knowledge of the heavens became suspicious. Astronomical study became heretically tainted. The Church understood that cosmological knowledge supported these alternative practices. By controlling knowledge of the cosmos, Rome could sever the connection between astronomy and spirituality. By declaring certain astronomical knowledge forbidden, the Church attempted to make the cosmic dimensions of spirituality inaccessible. Yet the sky remained visible to anyone willing to look upward during dark hours. The stars continued their ancient patterns, regardless of ecclesiastical prohibition. And for those who knew how to read celestial events, the cosmos continued communicating its messages. Late-night watchers, those awake during hours when stars shine most brilliantly, encountered the heavens directly. They experienced the sky as a vast presence communicating meaning through light and motion and stellar configurations. The forbidden practices connected them to this cosmic reality in ways that official Christianity, focused on earthly institutional structures, could never provide. For centuries, forbidden communities gathered according to celestial calendars, conducted rituals aligned with cosmic patterns, and sustained cosmological knowledge the Church wanted erased. They bound themselves to the cosmos and to each other, creating networks of spiritual community that transcended earthly hierarchies. But no secret remains hidden indefinitely. Around the year 1184, something new emerged from Rome's bureaucracy. Not a spontaneous response to sudden heretical crisis, but rather a calculated institutional innovation designed for a specific purpose: systematic identification and elimination of religious practices threatening church authority. The Inquisition wasn't born from theological debate or spiritual concern. It was engineered. It was infrastructure for control. And once constructed, it would reshape how persecution operated across Europe for centuries. The medieval Inquisition evolved gradually from earlier, less organized forms of heresy investigation. Before its formalization, bishops handled accusations of heretical belief within their dioceses. The process was inconsistent, sometimes brutal, and sometimes surprisingly lenient. Rome recognized the inefficiency. Inconsistent enforcement meant heretical practices survived in some regions while being suppressed in others. Different bishops applied different standards. Some were sympathetic to alternative spirituality. Some were insufficiently rigorous. Rome needed standardization. It needed an apparatus, unconstrained by local politics or episcopal sympathy. The Inquisition was the answer. Successive popes expanded inquisitorial powers through a series of councils and papal decrees. Funding increased dramatically. Talented administrators were recruited specifically to develop systematized procedures for investigation and prosecution. The institution that emerged bore remarkable resemblance to modern bureaucratic intelligence agencies. It developed specialized knowledge. It created detailed protocols. It built comprehensive filing systems documenting accusations and outcomes. It trained interrogators in specific techniques. It established networks across European territories, allowing information sharing and coordinated campaigns. This wasn't medieval chaos or religious zealotry operating randomly. This was sophisticated institutional machinery, designed with clear purpose and deliberate methodology. The procedural innovations were particularly significant. Earlier heresy trials required substantial evidence and allowed accused persons meaningful opportunity for defense. Inquisitorial procedure shifted the burden of proof fundamentally. Accusations themselves became nearly sufficient for conviction. The accused was required to prove their innocence rather than accusers proving guilt. This reversal created perverse incentives. Inquisitors benefited from accusations whether they led to conviction or not. Accusations justified continued investigation and employment. Threats of prosecution encouraged further accusations, as people sought to protect themselves through preemptive denunciation. The system fed on itself, generating accusations that generated more accusations. Inquisitors developed increasingly detailed catalogues of suspicious behaviors. Unusual gathering patterns, meeting privately at odd hours, traveling between distant locations, maintaining social connections across geographic boundaries, all became potentially incriminating. Possession of certain texts indicated dangerous knowledge. Use of specific terminology, references to ancient practices, knowledge of astronomical principles, or ancient languages, all could trigger investigation. The intelligence was comprehensive. Inquisitors built profiles of suspicious individuals and networks. They documented social connections. They tracked patterns suggesting organized activity. What emerged was a taxonomy of suspicion so elaborate that ordinary human behavior became criminalized. The Inquisition's expert interrogators developed sophisticated techniques for extracting confessions. Leading questions shaped answers toward desired conclusions. Torture was theoretically reserved for circumstances requiring truth extraction, yet in practice was applied liberally. Torture produced confessions, and confessions produced further accusations. The machinery of persecution generated its own evidence. An innocent person tortured into confession would, under continued pressure, name others as co-conspirators. Those named would be arrested, tortured, and would similarly produce accusations. Networks that may have been fragmented or small became, through confessional testimony, reconstructed as vast organized conspiracies. Particularly insidious was the use of expert witnesses. Individuals claimed to have participated in forbidden practices who had supposedly reformed or been converted. These witnesses would validate inquisitorial theories about what practices involved. Their testimony created appearance of authoritative knowledge. Yet many such witnesses were themselves tortured or coerced into producing testimony fitting inquisitorial expectations. They were incentivized to confirm what interrogators wanted confirmed. The result was systematic manufacture of evidence, supporting predetermined conclusions. Inquisitorial campaigns targeted specific populations believed to harbor forbidden practices. Noble families with suspected heretical sympathies faced investigation and property seizure. Monastic communities that seemed insufficiently orthodox were scrutinized intensely. Communities identified with folk magic or healing practices became targets. The intensity varied geographically, suggesting strategic targeting rather than random zealotry. Certain regions experienced systematic, sustained persecution. Others remained relatively untouched. This geographical variation reflected either regional differences in inquisitorial interest or differences in how successfully forbidden communities concealed themselves. What's striking is the Inquisition's remarkable competence as an institution. It wasn't medieval superstition operating haphazardly. It was bureaucratic apparatus, deploying surveillance, interrogation, and information systems with sophisticated methodology. When Rome decided something should be eliminated, the Inquisition possessed tools and determination to accomplish that elimination. Yet elimination required identifying what to eliminate. The Inquisition faced a peculiar problem. Forbidden practices, by definition, concealed themselves. The communities practicing these rituals didn't advertise their activities. They maintained secrecy. They operated in hidden spaces. Traditional enforcement methods, open investigation, community observation, obvious signs of transgression, couldn't work against something designed to remain invisible. The Inquisition required new mechanisms for identifying targets. It had to create systems that transformed invisible activity into visible evidence that made the hidden observable. Denunciation became the primary tool. The Inquisition couldn't rely on direct observation. Instead, it incentivized people to report suspected heresy. Anyone could denounce anyone. Family members could accuse relatives. Neighbors could inform on neighbors. The system created comprehensive surveillance through distributed networks of potential informers. Everyone became a potential investigator. Fear itself became an investigative instrument. If you lived in a territory where denunciations triggered investigation and prosecution, you learned to be cautious about what you said, whom you associated with, what you read or possessed. The psychological dynamics were calculated. Fear incentivized reporting because people believed that accusing others preemptively would protect themselves. If you feared your own activities might draw scrutiny, denouncing someone else demonstrated your orthodoxy. Accusers positioned themselves as loyal believers, protecting the church from heresy. The system created paranoia. People couldn't trust neighbors or colleagues. Anyone might be informing. This paranoia weakened communities by destroying internal cohesion. People stopped trusting each other. Networks fragmented as members became afraid of being betrayed. Interrogation techniques were refined through practice and systematized through documented procedures. Inquisitors learned that certain questioning patterns worked effectively. Leading questions that suggested desired answers. Repetitive questioning, wearing down resistance through exhaustion. Questions that assumed facts not established, creating impression that authorities already possessed knowledge. A skilled interrogator could extract confessions from innocent people by creating psychological conditions where confession seemed like the only escape from unbearable pressure. Torture occupied a peculiar place within this system. Theoretically, torture was justified as truth-seeking, a way to break through false denial. In practice, torture produced whatever confessions interrogators were seeking. A person tortured into confessing to forbidden ritual participation would, under continued pressure, name associates, describe ceremonies matching interrogator expectations, confirm details interrogators suggested. The tortured person's testimony became evidence used to arrest and torture others who would similarly produce confessions. The machinery ground forward, generating victims whose testimony generated more victims. Inquisitors developed comprehensive profiles of suspicious individuals. Knowledge of astronomy, ancient languages, or practices suggesting esoteric learning marked someone as potentially heretical. Unusual social connections, particularly maintaining relationships across normal social boundaries or traveling between distant locations, triggered investigation. Associations with certain families, particularly noble families or families known for maintaining alternative traditions, rendered someone suspicious. Possession of certain texts was immediately incriminating. Participation in activities that seemed innocent but fit patterns inquisitors associated with heresy, private gatherings, discussion of theological topics, interest in historical knowledge became potential evidence. The brilliant toxicity of this system was its comprehensive suspicion. Someone couldn't simply live quietly and avoid investigation. Avoiding suspicion required performing intense, visible orthodoxy. You had to attend Mass regularly and visibly. You had to demonstrate piety through speech and action. You had to avoid friendships with anyone else the Inquisition suspected. You had to not read unusual texts. You had to not possess knowledge that made authorities suspicious. You had to, in essence, make yourself smaller, duller, less interesting. The system incentivized intellectual conformity and emotional suppression. These hunting methods achieved their purpose effectively, though not perfectly. Some communities managed to survive or hide successfully, yet the pressure was constant and intensifying. Forbidden communities couldn't operate at previous levels of openness. They couldn't maintain large gatherings. They couldn't preserve libraries of ritual texts. They couldn't transmit knowledge as openly. They were forced to fragment, to hide more carefully, to reduce their visibility. The pressure didn't destroy these communities immediately, but it forced them to transform. Yet despite everything the inquisitorial apparatus deployed, these practices didn't simply vanish. The Great Erasure occurred between the 15th and 17th centuries, though persecution intensified at different moments in different regions. This was the period when forbidden practices faced systematic, sustained assault from an opponent possessing overwhelming institutional resources. The inquisitorial apparatus, now mature and experienced, deployed its full machinery against the communities it had identified. This was not sporadic persecution, but calculated elimination campaigns. Libraries and scriptoria became particular targets. Inquisitors understood what historians often overlook. Knowledge stored in texts can be discovered, preserved, transmitted across generations. Destroy a text, and you destroy the knowledge it contains, at least its most precise, detailed form. The Inquisition systematized book destruction. Grimoires disappeared from libraries across Europe. Ritual texts were burned. Monastic scriptoria, housing potentially dangerous manuscripts, were targeted. Whole categories of knowledge were eliminated physically. The loss was staggering. We will never know what was completely destroyed, what knowledge vanished entirely, leaving no trace for later recovery. The paradox was profound. Intensive persecution accelerated the very erasure Rome intended. As inquisitorial pressure mounted, forbidden communities were forced to make impossible choices. Preserve written knowledge and risk having communities destroyed, or destroy records preemptively to protect themselves. Most communities chose self-destruction of their own archives. Books were burned. Manuscripts were destroyed. Knowledge was deliberately obliterated by the communities that possessed it, because preserving that knowledge meant risking prosecution and execution. The victims of persecution destroyed what they most valued to survive. Lineages of transmission were broken. Older practitioners who possessed knowledge couldn't safely initiate successors into their traditions. The Inquisition's effectiveness at identifying and prosecuting members meant new initiates represented potential infiltrators or future sources of denunciation. Trust evaporated. Knowledge couldn't be transmitted. When elder practitioners died, whether from age or execution, the knowledge often died with them. Entire branches of traditions were lost. The communities that survived were often severely diminished, maintaining only fragments of what had once been comprehensive systems. The psychological toll was immense. Constant fear of denunciation, suspicion within communities as people wondered who might be informers, loss of sacred spaces as meeting locations were discovered and destroyed, inability to conduct ceremonies requiring multiple participants or special locations, grief over executed community members, despair as practices faced genuine threat of complete elimination. Some practitioners recanted under pressure, publicly renouncing their traditions. Others maintained secrecy, but lost will to continue active practice. The vibrant underground communities became ghost networks of isolated individuals, uncertain whether anyone else still practiced. Yet something remarkable occurred. Complete erasure failed. Some communities survived the persecution by going even deeper underground. They abandoned large gatherings and maintained practice in family units or pairs. Knowledge was preserved primarily through oral transmission and memory rather than texts. Some traditions transformed into forms that appeared acceptable to authorities. Folk practices that seemed innocent, activities that fit within permitted religious expression. They evolved to survive, shedding recognizable identity but preserving essence. The persecution achieved substantial success. Most visible forbidden communities were destroyed, texts were burned, networks were disrupted. The vibrant alternative spirituality that had thrived for centuries was driven into fragmented isolation. Yet the success of persecution created peculiar historical consequence. Because the persecution succeeded, most evidence was destroyed. We don't find elaborate records documenting widespread forbidden practice. The absence of records appears to historians as evidence that such practices weren't very extensive. In reality, the absence itself is the fingerprint of successful erasure. Effective persecution leaves few traces precisely because it destroys the evidence of what it persecutes. Forbidden practices didn't end when persecution intensified. They transformed. This distinction is crucial for understanding how traditions persisted through centuries of systematic assault. The rituals didn't continue exactly as they had been performed in earlier, more tolerant centuries. They couldn't. Performing them identically would have meant immediate discovery and destruction. Instead, communities engaged in desperate creativity, adapting practices to survive while retaining their essential character and power. Consider how transformation functioned at practical levels. A ceremony that had once involved dozens of participants gathering in a cathedral crypt was reimagined as a private family ritual conducted in a home. The core elements remained the symbolic structure, the spiritual intention, the communion with something sacred, but compressed into forms requiring fewer people and smaller spaces. A ritual tied to specific astronomical events that couldn't be safely conducted on those dates was shifted in timing while maintaining its cosmological meaning. The practice persisted, but it morphed into new shapes. The disguise mechanisms were remarkably sophisticated. What had been explicitly esoteric knowledge, taught through direct instruction to initiated communities, was now embedded in apparently innocent forms. Ritual instructions appeared encoded within poetic verses that could be shared publicly without raising suspicion. Someone reading a folk poem might encounter beautiful language about nature and seasons. An initiated reader, possessing keys to the encoding system, could extract detailed ritual procedures. The knowledge existed in plain sight, accessible to those prepared to receive it, invisible to those lacking the interpretive framework. Esoteric knowledge migrated into alternative vessels. What had been sacred ceremonial practice became folk tradition. What had been initiated, mysteries became seasonal customs, practiced openly but understood differently by different participants. A community celebration of the spring equinox looked like innocent festivity to outsiders, people gathering, feasting, dancing. Yet for those who knew, it contained ritual elements, preserving practices Rome wanted erased. The celebrations appeared to conform to acceptable religious practice while actually transmitting forbidden knowledge. The threat of persecution created what evolutionary biologists might call selective pressure. Communities that couldn't adapt their practices quickly enough faced elimination. Those that evolved rapidly survived. This created natural selection among forbidden traditions. The practices that persisted were those most amenable to adaptation and disguise, most capable of maintaining essential meaning while transforming external appearance. Traditions requiring large permanent organizations or elaborate physical infrastructure were destroyed. Traditions that could contract into family units or adapt to minimal resources persisted. Family transmission became increasingly important as institutional channels became dangerous. A father could teach his son practices that appeared to be family tradition rather than heresy. A mother could transmit knowledge to her daughter framed as folk wisdom rather than forbidden ritual. Family bonds created inherent secrecy. Children were unlikely to betray parents to authorities. Inheritance of knowledge through family lines made transmission appear natural rather than heretical. The knowledge seemed to be cultural heritage passed between generations, not organized heresy deliberately propagated. The adaptive genius was breathtaking. Practices that had involved elaborate ceremonial spaces were simplified to function in any private location. Ceremonies requiring specific liturgical language were transformed into practices operating through symbolic gesture and internal mental discipline. Rituals demanding community participation were converted into individual or paired practices. The essential spiritual intention persisted even as external form radically changed. At some point, the transformation became so complete that participants wondered whether they still practiced the same traditions their ancestors had conducted. The answer was ambiguous. They had transformed radically. Yet something essential had survived the transformation, something that practitioners recognized as continuous with what had come before. Folk medicine preserved ritual knowledge. A healer's practice treating physical illness through herbal remedies and ritual words might, to informed observers, contain elements of forbidden ceremonies. The healing functioned through multiple levels simultaneously. The herbs had genuine medicinal properties, the ritual words and actions had psychological effects, and for those who knew how to read them, the practices contained esoteric knowledge. A visitor seeking healing would observe someone treating illness. An initiated practitioner would recognize something far deeper occurring. Crafts and trades became knowledge transmission systems. Specialized knowledge passed from master to apprentice information that appeared to concern the craft itself, but actually encoded ritual practice and esoteric cosmology. A mason might learn specific geometric principles, framed as practical building knowledge, but actually encoding sacred geometry. A physician might learn herbal formulations that were simultaneously medical practice and ritual knowledge. These professions offered cover for transmitting forbidden knowledge because their technical expertise created natural channels for complex information transmission. The fundamental paradox was that adaptation made these practices simultaneously more resilient and less recognizable as what they had originally been. As individual practices adapted and transformed, the organizational structures containing them evolved equally dramatically. Communities facing systematic persecution learned through hard experience that centralized hierarchies were vulnerabilities. If leaders could be identified, arrested, and executed, the organization collapsed. Surviving communities shifted toward distributed structures that resembled modern clandestine networks more than medieval religious organizations. Compartmentalization became the organizing principle. An individual participant knew the members of their immediate circle, but remained ignorant of the broader network's extent. They might know 5 people well and trust them absolutely. They knew those 5 people participated in practices, but couldn't know whether those 5 people themselves led other groups or answered to higher authority. This fragmentation served crucial security purposes. If someone was captured and tortured into revealing names, they could only reveal people they personally knew. The interrogation couldn't expose the entire network because the tortured person literally didn't know the entire network. Knowledge was fractured across multiple nodes, none of which possessed complete awareness of the system's total structure. Communication protocols evolved to permit coordination without creating comprehensive records that authorities could seize. Certain symbols, subtle enough to seem meaningless to outsiders, conveyed complex information to those trained in their interpretation. A specific mark on a document, a particular arrangement of objects in a window, the order of words in an apparently innocent letter, all could communicate information between separated groups. Travelers moving between communities carried information verbally or through objects, avoiding written documentation. The systems were redundant. Multiple communication channels existed in case one was compromised. Authentication protocols prevented infiltration. How could you verify that someone claiming to be an initiate actually was? The Inquisition employed infiltrators who attempted to infiltrate communities by claiming to be persecuted practitioners seeking refuge. Surviving communities developed verification procedures, sometimes specific knowledge that could only be acquired through genuine initiation. Sometimes lengthy observation periods, where suspected newcomers proved themselves through consistent trustworthiness before full participation occurred. The process was deliberately slow. Rushing initiation meant accepting infiltration risk. Better to move carefully, take time, establish genuine trust before revealing truly sensitive knowledge. The role of initiation expanded beyond spiritual transformation into security function. The more rigorous the initiation process, the deeper the commitment required, the greater the trust participants felt toward each other. Someone who had endured genuine ordeal with a community felt bonded to that community in ways difficult to betray. Initiation created psychological investment. It transformed relationship from superficial association to something profoundly intimate. Betraying community members after undergoing initiation together felt like betraying oneself. Secrecy itself became a bonding mechanism. The act of maintaining dangerous secrets together created trust exceeding ordinary social connection. People living within broader society that viewed their practices as demonic and heretical experienced profound alienation. Within the secret community, however, they found others who understood, who shared their convictions, who validated their experiences. The secrecy that separated them from general society simultaneously bound them intensely to each other. They were inside something true, while the broader world remained asleep in falsehood. This sense of belonging to something real and true was deeply psychologically powerful. These organizational innovations made enforcement increasingly difficult. Authorities couldn't arrest their way to destroying networks they couldn't fully map. Arresting individual members disrupted immediate circles, but didn't disable the broader network. The network would reorganize, shift connections, continue forward. Multiple redundancies meant that losing one node didn't cascade into system failure. The networks became not only survivable, but genuinely resilient. They could sustain significant damage and continue functioning. By the late medieval and early modern periods, the most successful forbidden communities had become organizational models of extraordinary sophistication. They maintained strong internal bonds despite geographic separation. They preserved and transmitted knowledge despite active suppression. They conducted practices despite criminal penalties. They evolved faster than institutional persecution could adapt to their changes. They achieved something remarkable. They became organizations designed from inception for resistance to destruction, for operating under conditions of persecution, for maintaining coherence when everything pressed toward dissolution. Yet organization alone couldn't preserve knowledge. Communities required technologies for storing information, transmitting it across generations, maintaining accuracy despite danger and disruption. When written texts became too dangerous, forbidden communities invented alternative technologies for preserving knowledge. This wasn't simply retreat to primitive orality. Instead, practitioners developed extraordinarily sophisticated systems for encoding, storing, and transmitting information through channels that authorities couldn't detect or destroy. Oral transmission was refined to remarkable precision through specialized mnemonic techniques. Certain information was memorized through rigorous repetition, through embedding in rhythm and poetic language, through association with physical locations and objects. A practitioner might memorize elaborate ritual procedures by walking through a specific space while reciting, creating spatial memory anchors. Another might store knowledge through elaborate poetic verses whose structure aided memorization despite their apparent innocence to outsiders. The accuracy of oral transmission, when properly practiced, rivals textual recording. Information passed through trained memory systems survives with fidelity approaching written sources. Knowledge was encoded within artistic and architectural forms. A painting's composition, its symbolic elements, its colors and proportions, could communicate ritual knowledge to those trained in interpretation. A building's architecture, its geometry, its orientation, its decorative elements functioned as three-dimensional text, encoding cosmological and ritual information. These artistic and architectural systems had advantages over written texts. They appeared to be art rather than heretical documentation. A painting hanging in someone's home seemed innocent. Yet for someone possessing interpretive keys, the painting transmitted detailed information about forbidden practices and cosmological understanding. Music and poetry became transmission systems. Ritual knowledge was embedded in seemingly innocent folk songs whose lyrics contained multiple layers of meaning. A simple love song, to casual listeners, was merely romantic verse. To initiated ears, the same song contained detailed ritual procedures, cosmological references, and esoteric teachings. The same song could be sung in public without raising suspicion, while simultaneously transmitting dangerous knowledge to those prepared to receive it. Poetry operated similarly, using metaphor and symbolic language to communicate on multiple levels simultaneously. Objects became information storage devices. A seemingly decorative item possessed hidden compartments or symbolic meanings that conveyed information. A family heirloom contained encoded knowledge. Ordinary craft objects carried esoteric information in their proportions or construction methods. An informed craftsperson could reconstruct forbidden knowledge from examining how a particular object was constructed. The object itself was innocuous, but its construction principles preserved knowledge. Strategic relationships with libraries and sympathetic scriptoria preserved written texts within seemingly legitimate collections. A monk trusted with a library's management might preserve dangerous texts among masses of orthodox works where they would be overlooked. Ritual texts might be bound within legitimate theological works, their dangerous portions hidden among hundreds of pages of innocuous commentary. The texts survived because they weren't easily recognizable as dangerous material. The most powerful preservation technology was redundancy. Knowledge wasn't preserved in single locations, but distributed across multiple communities and through multiple channels. Even if a library was destroyed or a community was eliminated, the knowledge persisted elsewhere. An oral tradition survived as long as one person remained who had memorized it. Architectural knowledge existed as long as buildings embodied it. Artistic knowledge persisted as long as paintings survived. Musical knowledge lived in songs people continued singing. Individuals with access to multiple worlds, learned clergy with access to libraries, artists and craftspeople with social mobility, travelers moving between communities, functioned as crucial knowledge vectors. They could carry information between dispersed communities. They could preserve texts through their positions. They could ensure that even if one channel of transmission was destroyed, others remained viable. These preservation technologies created knowledge systems that were distributed, redundant, and remarkably resilient. The traditions that survived persecution survived not by remaining exactly as they had been, but by transforming into forms capable of surviving under conditions of systematic assault. They adapted. They evolved. They persisted. Something fundamental shifted around the year 1450. Not a sudden rupture, but rather a gradual loosening of the institutional grip that had maintained medieval religious uniformity. The apparatus of persecution didn't disappear. The Inquisition continued operating. Yet the conditions sustaining absolute enforcement had begun fracturing. The monopoly on knowledge and authority that Rome had maintained for centuries started splintering into fragments, creating spaces where what had been completely forbidden could become merely controversial, then debated, then accepted by some communities, while still condemned by others. The catalyst came from multiple directions simultaneously. Renaissance scholars began recovering classical texts, preserved in scattered monastic libraries and Byzantine archives. These ancient texts, Plato, Neoplatonists, Hermetic writings discussed spirituality, cosmology, and human transformation in ways that didn't fit medieval categories. They revealed that the greatest minds of classical antiquity had engaged with ideas strikingly similar to those forbidden medieval practices addressed. How could ideas that occupied the greatest philosophers of ancient times be categorically heretical? The classical texts provided intellectual legitimacy for ideas Rome had tried to suppress. Scholarship on ancient philosophy created space for discussing concepts that would have been immediately condemned if presented as medieval heresy. The Protestant Reformation fragmented unified church authority in ways medieval persecution apparatus couldn't have anticipated. Suddenly, Rome's authority wasn't universal. Regions that broke with papal authority developed their own theological and spiritual frameworks. Practices forbidden by Rome might be tolerated in Protestant territories. Individuals persecuted in Catholic regions could flee to Protestant areas where their practices weren't prosecuted. The geographic fragmentation of religious authority meant that what was forbidden in one place could be accepted elsewhere. Networks that had required absolute secrecy within medieval Catholic territories could operate more openly in reformed regions. Geographic expansion exposed Europeans to spiritual traditions that didn't fit medieval Christian categories at all. As Europeans encountered Islamic knowledge systems, Indian spirituality, and other non-Christian traditions through trade and exploration, European intellectuals recognized that genuine spiritual wisdom existed outside Christianity. The claim that all truth resided exclusively within Christian doctrine became harder to maintain when confronted with sophisticated spiritual knowledge from other traditions. The intellectual monopoly Christianity had maintained fractured. Pluralism became intellectually respectable. Most profoundly, European intellectual life gradually secularized. Authority shifted from purely theological frameworks toward philosophical, mathematical, and observational frameworks. The university system expanded. Printing technology democratized knowledge. Intellectual authority became distributed among multiple centers rather than concentrated in Rome. A scholar could make arguments grounded in reason and evidence rather than theological appeals. This secularization created space for discussions that theological authorities couldn't immediately shut down as heretical because they weren't framed as theological claims at all. Within this opening environment, practices that medieval practitioners had hidden completely began emerging into relative visibility. Renaissance mages and occultists published texts on astrology and ritual magic that circulated widely despite church opposition. The books were controversial, certainly. Authorities condemned them. Yet they couldn't be suppressed as effectively as medieval manuscript copies could be destroyed. Printed books existed in multiple copies across multiple territories. Suppressing them completely became impossible. Monastic communities began making more accessible texts on alternative spirituality that had been preserved through centuries of secrecy. Some monasteries, particularly in regions with weaker papal authority, published or allowed circulation of manuscripts they had protected through the inquisitorial era. Knowledge that had been preserved in hidden archives began entering broader intellectual circulation. Intellectual movements like Hermeticism and Neoplatonism drew on classical texts and created philosophical frameworks resonating with themes forbidden medieval practices had addressed. These movements functioned as intellectual cover. Someone could study Hermetic philosophy as legitimate classical scholarship, while actually engaging with ideas and practices functionally identical to medieval forbidden spirituality. The frameworks changed. The content persisted. Patronage networks increasingly protected alternative spiritual practitioners. Powerful nobles and church officials, sometimes genuinely interested in esoteric knowledge, sometimes simply exercising authority against papal restrictions, provided protection and resources for practitioners and communities operating in spiritual territories. Rome condemned. A cardinal interested in occult knowledge could protect a mage from inquisitorial prosecution. A wealthy merchant could fund esoteric schools. Geographic distribution of power meant that protective patrons could shelter practitioners from persecution. This transition wasn't uniform across Europe. Some regions remained repressively controlled, others developed relative openness. Forbidden practices inhabited a liminal zone, where they remained hidden in intensely controlled areas, barely tolerated in transitional regions, and increasingly openly practiced in more pluralistic territories. The space had opened. Institutional authority had fractured enough that shadows could step into light. History rarely records revolutionary transformations occurring suddenly. Instead, individuals emerge who navigate the boundaries between old and new worlds, who maintain connection to hidden traditions while beginning to make those traditions visible. These bridge figures possessed something crucial: access to forbidden knowledge through family lineage, monastic training, or networks within underground communities. They also possessed something equally crucial. They lived during moments when institutional pressure had weakened enough to permit limited visibility without guaranteeing destruction. Consider the historical mages of the Renaissance. Many possessed family connections to earlier practitioners. Some had monastic training, providing access to preserved texts and practices. They inherited knowledge that their predecessors had been forced to conceal absolutely. Yet they lived in an era where that knowledge could be partially visible without triggering immediate execution. They operated strategically, never completely exposing themselves, but gradually revealing more than previous generations could have safely revealed. These bridge figures made constant strategic calculations. How much could be published without triggering violent suppression? How much should remain esoteric? When could ideas be openly discussed? When must they remain coded? A text on alchemy might discuss spiritual transformation through language that appeared to concern chemical processes. A philosophical treatise on Neoplatonism could explore consciousness and cosmic participation in apparently scholarly language. A medical text could preserve ritual healing knowledge within legitimate medical terminology. The bridge figures developed these encoding strategies deliberately, allowing dangerous knowledge to circulate while maintaining plausible distance from explicit heresy. Patronage profoundly shaped what these figures could accomplish. A cardinal interested in occult knowledge could protect a scholar or practitioner, shielding them from inquisitorial prosecution. A wealthy merchant, patronizing an esoteric school, provided resources and legitimacy. Noble protection allowed practitioners to operate more openly than would have been possible without powerful allies. The most successful bridge figures cultivated such patrons carefully, understanding that patronage meant survival. Without protection, even Renaissance relative openness offered limited safety. Specific decisions these figures faced reveal their moral complexity. How much to hide versus reveal? Whether to publish manuscripts that could be seized or preserve them in secret? Whether to accept promising students into esoteric knowledge or restrict teaching to close family? Whether to risk explicit statements of dangerous ideas or maintain comfortable ambiguity? These weren't abstract ethical questions. They were practical decisions with immediate consequences. A wrong choice meant prosecution, torture, execution. Many bridge figures were genuinely ambivalent about complete visibility. They believed some knowledge should remain esoteric not from cowardice or desire for power, but from conviction that certain truths required preparation and initiation to properly receive. They wanted knowledge preserved and transmitted, but not abandoned to casual public access. They sought emergence from persecution without complete democratization. They wanted their traditions respected and safer, but not vulgarized through mass accessibility. The risks were real and constant. Political winds could shift, a protective patron could fall from favor. Church authorities could decide that relative tolerance had proceeded too far. Many bridge figures operated, knowing that their safety remained provisional, that they could face prosecution if circumstances changed. Yet they continued the work. They published texts despite risks. They taught students despite dangers. They gradually increased visibility despite uncertainty about consequences. Their commitment suggests genuine conviction that making knowledge visible was worth the danger. Some bridge figures paid severe prices. Others navigated their era successfully without prosecution. What united them was their willingness to exist in dangerous ambiguity, to be neither fully hidden nor fully open, to gradually shift the boundaries of what could be discussed and practiced. They created possibility that their successors could operate more openly still. They transformed forbidden knowledge into merely controversial knowledge, creating space for eventual acceptance. Yet individual courage alone couldn't fundamentally transform the landscape. For sustained change to occur, the conceptual frameworks through which people understood alternative spirituality needed transformation. The forbidden doesn't disappear when you rename it. It transforms. Renaissance and early modern intellectuals didn't eliminate the practices and ideas Rome had condemned. They discovered new languages for discussing them, languages that made identical concepts seem scholarly rather than heretical, philosophical rather than demonic, scientifically interesting rather than spiritually dangerous. Hermetic philosophy provided crucial intellectual scaffolding. These recovered classical texts discussed divine knowledge, spiritual transformation, and cosmic principles in ways that paralleled forbidden medieval practices. Yet, discussing Hermeticism seemed legitimate. It was classical scholarship, recovering ancient wisdom. The same ideas that would have triggered immediate prosecution as medieval heresy became acceptable when framed as recovery of Greek and Egyptian philosophy. The content remained fundamentally similar. The conceptual framework changed. Alchemy underwent similar transformation. For centuries, alchemical texts had preserved ritual and spiritual knowledge disguised within apparently chemical language. Renaissance scholars began treating alchemy as proto-scientific endeavor to understand matter and transformation. This framework allowed alchemical texts to circulate and be studied as legitimate intellectual work rather than heretical practice. The spiritual dimensions remained encoded within the chemical language, accessible to those trained in interpretation, invisible to casual observers. Alchemy became respectable scholarship while actually preserving and transmitting forbidden knowledge. Astrology similarly reframed itself through mathematical and observational language. What had been recognized as spiritual cosmology, claiming human participation in cosmic patterns, was presented as mathematical study of celestial movements. The cosmic framework persisted. The language changed. Mathematical terminology provided intellectual cover. Studying celestial events for astrological purposes became scientifically interesting rather than spiritually transgressive. Classical scholarship offered perhaps the most powerful intellectual cover. By discussing Platonism or Neoplatonism, intellectuals could explore ideas about the soul, consciousness, cosmic participation, and human transformation. These weren't medieval heretical teachings. These were ancient philosophical traditions worthy of scholarly attention. Yet the actual content exploration of how individual consciousness relates to universal reality, how transformation of consciousness is possible, how humans participate in cosmic patterns, was functionally identical to forbidden medieval practices. The framework mattered more than the content. When discussions framed themselves as classical scholarship, they escaped theological condemnation. These intellectual reframings weren't mere camouflage. They represented genuine shifts in how Europeans understood knowledge and authority. When Hermetic philosophy or Neoplatonism could be discussed as legitimate scholarship, it meant that authority had shifted from purely theological frameworks to frameworks including philosophical legitimacy. Ideas no longer required church approval to be respectable. Scholarly credibility became achievable through means other than ecclesiastical endorsement. Through individual courage, institutional fragmentation, and intellectual reframing, forbidden medieval practices gradually emerged into relative visibility. They didn't emerge suddenly or completely. Many remained hidden. Persecution continued in some territories, yet the absolute suppression that had characterized the medieval era had loosened. What had been absolutely forbidden was becoming merely controversial, then tolerated, then accepted in some contexts. We arrive now at the detective work. The investigation into what actually survived, what it reveals, and crucially, what its survival tells us about what didn't survive. The irony at the heart of medieval forbidden practices is that our primary sources come from the persecutors themselves. The Inquisition created detailed records, trial transcripts survive, confessions were documented. Interrogations were written down. The institution most dedicated to erasing these practices inadvertently created the primary archive for understanding them. The persecutor's machinery became the persecuted's historical record. Yet these sources demand careful interpretation. Inquisitorial documents describe forbidden practices through the lens of what inquisitors believed constituted heresy. Their descriptions were filtered through prejudice and institutional framework. A ceremony that participants experienced as direct communion with the divine might be recorded by inquisitors as demonic possession. A ritual, intentionally designed for spiritual transformation, might be described as simple witchcraft. The practices as recorded by persecutors and the practices as experienced by participants occupied different universes of meaning. The texts reveal what authorities wanted to suppress, but not necessarily what that suppression was suppressing. Monastic manuscripts offer different challenges and possibilities. Monks preserved ritual knowledge, often without explicit context. A passage describing a ceremony appears in a manuscript dealing nominally with something else. Interpretation requires training in recognizing codes and symbolic language. A discussion of botanical properties might actually concern herbal practices within rituals. References to astronomical events might describe when ceremonies were conducted. The knowledge is there, but encrypted within theological language. Misinterpretation is easy. Careful interpretation requires understanding both medieval scholarly language and the specific encoding systems particular communities developed. Trial testimony from accused heretics and witches provides evidence of a different character. These are the voices of accused practitioners, though filtered through torture, coercion, and interrogators leading questions. Yet within this testimony, genuine descriptions of practices sometimes emerge. When testimony from different accused individuals, from different regions and time periods, describes similar ritual structures and experiences, the consistency suggests something reliable. People didn't collude across centuries or continents, yet their descriptions cohere. This coherence itself becomes evidence of organized traditions rather than random individual aberrations. Architectural and archaeological evidence speaks differently. Buildings don't lie about their construction purposes as easily as documents can be distorted. A crypt beneath a cathedral, with unusual acoustic properties, specific geometric proportions, and decorative elements suggesting ritual use, these physical facts constitute evidence. The space was designed for purposes beyond standard ecclesiastical function. An informed observer can read architecture like text. The geometry encodes information. The orientation reveals astronomical knowledge. The decorative symbolism communicates meaning. Artistic evidence similarly inscribes meaning into physical form. Medieval paintings and sculptures often contained symbolic elements that appear purely decorative to casual observers. Yet these symbols communicated to informed viewers. Specific arrangements of figures, particular symbols, certain proportions and colors, all could encode ritual or cosmological knowledge. An artwork functioning on multiple levels simultaneously as legitimate religious art to casual viewers, as encoded esoteric knowledge to initiated observers, could circulate publicly while preserving and transmitting dangerous information. The particular significance of fragmentary evidence emerges when we notice patterns. A specific ritual element described in a 12th century manuscript appears again in a trial record from 2 centuries later in a different region. The same symbol appears in paintings separated by geography and time. Certain textual references appear in multiple independent sources, too similar to be coincidental. These patterns suggest not random aberrations, but organized, continuous traditions deliberately preserved across generations and territories. Yet, the historical record contains blank spaces, points where extensive documentation suddenly ceases, monastic archives, missing records from specific periods, church files with obvious gaps suggesting deliberate removal of documents. These absences speak loudly. The disappearance of certain types of text suggests systematic destruction. The silence where we might expect documentation suggests something was being hidden. These blank spaces don't represent accidents of preservation. They represent active erasure. Surviving documents constitute a fraction of what once existed. Their survival itself may be non-random. Documents carefully hidden survived. Documents that remained in circulation were destroyed. Texts preserved in isolated monastic communities escape destruction better than texts held in central repositories. This means surviving evidence may not represent what was historically most important. It represents what was most survivable. We may be reconstructing traditions based on what was successfully hidden, rather than what was central to these practices. The surviving evidence distorts historical reality by reflecting survival bias rather than historical significance. Yet patterns emerge from fragmentary evidence that patterns alone wouldn't have suggested. Let us examine them. Historical methodology demands careful work with incomplete evidence. We cannot simply declare that something existed because we possess fragments suggesting it. Yet we also cannot dismiss patterns as coincidence when those patterns repeat across independent sources. The investigative process involves identifying consistent elements, tracing connections, recognizing when similar structures appear in different contexts, and distinguishing between reliable evidence and wishful interpretation. Consider the ritual elements. Certain specific practices appear repeatedly across different documents from different centuries and regions. Symbolic death and rebirth ceremonies show up in trial testimony from accused heretics. Similar structures appear in fragmentary descriptions preserved in monastic manuscripts. Comparable experiences are reported in artistic depictions of spiritual transformation. Were these elements randomly invented in different times and places? The repetition suggests intentional preservation rather than coincidental similarity. These elements constituted core practices that communities deemed worth maintaining across centuries and persecution. Symbols display similar patterns. Specific geometric forms, particular arrangements of sacred space, certain symbolic representations appear in contexts separated by geography and time. A building in Germany built centuries before shares geometric principles with a French cathedral constructed in a different era. Medieval artwork incorporates symbols appearing in preserved manuscripts, describing forbidden practices. Trial records mention symbols that appear in decorative elements of ritual spaces. These symbolic consistencies suggest coordinated rather than isolated traditions. Someone designing a ritual space in the 15th century was working within a tradition with recognized symbolic vocabulary extending back generations. The symbols meant something specific. They communicated within communities while remaining invisible to outsiders. Textual references display remarkable consistency. Certain manuscripts appear referenced in multiple independent sources. A ritual text preserved in a monastic library is alluded to in a trial record. That same text appears encoded within what appears to be theological commentary. The references are too similar to be coincidental. These weren't random documents. They were actively transmitted, copied, referenced by communities deliberately preserving specific texts across generations. Someone in the 16th century referencing a manuscript that someone in the 12th century had also referenced suggests intentional knowledge transmission across centuries. Yet interpretation demands humility. Patterns can deceive. Symbols might be misinterpreted. Similar elements might emerge independently rather than through transmission. Trial testimony extracted under torture might reflect interrogator expectations rather than actual practices. We must examine not just patterns but counter-evidence and ambiguities. The challenge of interpreting ritual elements is particularly acute. Symbols shift meanings across time. Practices evolve. Languages obscure as much as reveal. The same ritual conducted in different eras might be understood entirely differently by participants. What we interpret as continuous tradition might actually represent radical transformation of meaning. A symbol carrying specific significance in the 12th century might mean something different in the 16th century. The form persists, but the meaning alters. Are we documenting tradition or merely visual similarity? Yet when interpretation remains rigorous, when we acknowledge uncertainty, when we distinguish between confident claims and speculative interpretation, patterns do suggest something meaningful. Ritual elements too specific to be accidental reappear across independent sources. Symbolic vocabularies, too elaborate to be invented multiple times independently suggest shared tradition. Textual references too precise to be coincidental suggest deliberate knowledge transmission. Architectural features too technically sophisticated to be random suggest intentional design encoding knowledge. When we combine this pattern-based analysis with other evidence architectural features, clearly suggesting ritual use, consistent descriptions of experiences in trial testimony, encoded knowledge recognizable in preserved texts, the case strengthens. No single piece of evidence proves anything definitively, yet evidence accumulates, patterns converge. A picture emerges suggesting organized, continuous traditions of forbidden practices persisting across centuries despite systematic persecution. The patterns suggest something real existed, something valuable enough that people risked everything to preserve it. History teaches us something crucial. What we know is shaped as much by what was destroyed as by what survived. The Inquisition didn't simply suppress forbidden practices. It systematically hunted and destroyed certain categories of texts with particular intensity. Ritual manuals disappeared. Cosmological treatises vanished from libraries. Texts describing forbidden ceremonies were targeted for destruction with urgency, suggesting authorities recognized their particular danger. The destruction itself becomes evidence. What Rome most feared destroying reveals what Rome most feared preserving. Documentation survives of systematic book burnings. Inquisitorial records describe burning specific types of texts. Trial records mention grimoires, and ritual manuals seized and destroyed. References appear in contemporary documents to texts that no longer exist. We know certain texts were destroyed. We know they mattered enough to warrant systematic elimination. We don't know what those texts contained because they were successfully destroyed. Gaps in monastic archives suggest deliberate removal of documents. Certain monasteries' records suddenly cease at specific periods. Catalogues reference manuscripts that can't be located. The disappearance isn't random. It concentrates around periods of intense inquisitorial activity. Someone removed documents, removed them carefully enough that we can't fully reconstruct what was taken. This selective removal suggests those documents contained something authorities deemed particularly dangerous. More speculatively, we can infer categories of knowledge completely lost to history. Certain types of texts, the Inquisition particularly targeted, ritual manuals, cosmological treatises, specific grimoire categories, have almost entirely disappeared. The absence itself becomes evidence. The intensity with which certain categories were destroyed suggests they contained something particularly threatening, yet we can never know what that content was. The knowledge is lost completely, leaving only the absence. This creates a profound epistemological problem. We're trying to reconstruct a tradition based largely on what escaped destruction. But what escaped destruction may not represent what was most important historically. It represents what was most survivable. Hidden documents survived better than documents in circulation. Remote monasteries preserved texts better than central repositories. Texts encoded and disguised survived better than explicit documentation. Our evidence base may reflect survival bias rather than historical reality. The practices we can most clearly identify may not have been historically central. The most important practices may have been completely destroyed, leaving us without even fragmentary evidence of their existence. What we don't know vastly exceeds what we know. The texts burned completely leave permanent gaps. We cannot even formulate accurate questions about what knowledge disappeared. The communities destroyed without leaving records are entirely lost to history. The traditions eliminated so thoroughly that no evidence survives don't appear in any historical narrative. They simply vanish as though they never existed. Yet the very thoroughness of the persecution creates paradoxical evidence. The fact that certain knowledge was destroyed so completely, that certain practices were hunted so intensely, suggests their genuine importance. The Church expended enormous resources eliminating specific practices. This expenditure testifies to those practices' significance. What authorities most feared destroying mattered most to those they persecuted. The historical record reveals tantalizing fragments of a vast landscape forbidden medieval institutions tried desperately to erase. Yet despite 5 centuries of persecution and suppression, some survived. The medieval practices didn't vanish into complete oblivion. They didn't end neatly at some historical boundary, after which everything changed. Instead, they evolved. They transformed. They migrated into different forms, influenced subsequent spiritual movements, and eventually began appearing openly in contexts where they had previously been utterly forbidden. To trace where these traditions went requires abandoning the idea of simple linear continuity. Instead, we discover complex genealogies where medieval practices influenced, inspired, or were directly incorporated into various modern spiritual movements across centuries. Modern occultism draws consciously on texts and practices with medieval roots. Renaissance grimoires preserved and transmitted forbidden medieval knowledge. These grimoires influenced early modern magical practitioners, who then influenced 19th century ceremonial magic organizations. The lineage is traceable through texts, through documented influences, through explicit references showing how later practitioners drew on earlier sources. A modern magician studying specific ceremonial procedures might be following instructions that trace directly back through Renaissance texts to medieval forbidden practices. The knowledge persisted, transformed through intermediate stages, but recognizable in its essential structure. Certain modern witchcraft traditions claim lineage to medieval persecuted populations, whether genealogically accurate or spiritually intentional. Whether or not practitioners actually descend from medieval witches, a historically contestable claim, many contemporary practitioners identify themselves as continuing traditions that survived persecution. This identification shapes their spiritual practice. If you understand yourself as inheriting a tradition persecuted by institutional power that influences how you approach your spirituality, how you view authority, how you understand your role as a practitioner, the identification itself functions as a form of continuity, even if genetic or direct textual continuity is uncertain. Modern mystery schools and esoteric organizations incorporate symbolic systems and initiatory structures recognizably similar to medieval practices. The structure of initiation, candidates undergoing ordeals, gradually receiving knowledge, ascending through degrees, taking vows of secrecy, parallels medieval forbidden practices. The symbolism, geometric forms, cosmological references, themes of death and rebirth echoes medieval traditions. Whether contemporary organizations deliberately recreated medieval structures, or whether similar human patterns of meaning-making naturally generate similar organizational forms remains debated. Yet the resemblance is striking enough that practitioners often consciously reference medieval predecessors. Medieval forbidden knowledge influenced Renaissance Hermeticism, which influenced 19th century theosophy, which influenced 20th century occultism and contemporary spiritual movements. The lineage isn't direct. It involves transformations and hybridizations. Yet tracing the influences reveals how core ideas and practices persist across centuries. The concept of hidden knowledge available to the initiated, the belief in cosmic patterns humans can align themselves with, the emphasis on direct experience and transformation, these themes appear in medieval texts, resurface in Renaissance philosophy, shape 19th century spirituality, and continue in contemporary practice. The forms change, the fundamental orientations persist. This historical consciousness of persecution and erasure profoundly shapes modern movements. Contemporary practitioners often identify strongly with medieval victims of persecution. They see themselves as continuing traditions that survived attempted elimination. They view institutional opposition to their practices with historical awareness of how such opposition has functioned historically. This identification influences contemporary political and spiritual positioning. Many contemporary practitioners see themselves as inheritors of persecuted wisdom traditions, which shapes their skepticism toward institutional authority and their conviction that certain knowledge is worth preserving despite opposition. Modern practitioners sometimes engage in what might be called experimental reconstruction. Historians and practitioners collaborate, examining fragmentary medieval evidence, attempting to recreate practices based on incomplete information. These reconstructions are necessarily speculative and partial. Practitioners acknowledge uncertainty. Yet the work of reconstruction itself constitutes a form of preservation and continuation. Whether modern practitioners are authentically recreating medieval practices or creatively reimagining them based on historical fragments, the act of reconstruction acknowledges those practices as meaningful and worth recovering. Whether or not modern practices are historically authentic continuations of medieval traditions remains genuinely ambiguous. Yet the existence of modern traditions claiming such continuity constitutes a form of persistence. The medieval practices survive not merely in fragmentary historical documents, but in living practice among contemporary communities. They're remembered, imagined, studied, and enacted by people who believe they're carrying forward traditions with medieval roots. This continuation in memory and imagination and practice represents a genuine form of survival. The traditions weren't completely erased. They persisted, transformed, evolving into modern contexts, while maintaining recognizable connections to their medieval origins. Yet individual practices and organizations matter less than what animated them. Look beyond specific rituals. Look beyond particular texts or organizations. Look instead at the fundamental orientation towards spirituality that animated medieval forbidden practices, and that continues influencing contemporary spirituality across multiple traditions. This orientation, this fundamental stance toward how knowledge, authority, spirituality, and experience interrelate, represents perhaps the most significant legacy of medieval forbidden practices. The core conviction is that direct spiritual experience holds more value than institutional authorization. A medieval practitioner undergoing ritual transformation, experiencing what they understood as communion with the divine, found that direct experience more meaningful than any church teaching about what spirituality should involve. A contemporary practitioner seeking direct mystical experience rather than intellectual faith similarly prioritizes encounter over doctrine. This conviction persists because for many people, direct experience genuinely matters more than institutional approval. Experience feels real in ways doctrine doesn't necessarily feel real. When someone experiences something they interpret as sacred encounter, institutional denial of that experience doesn't eliminate it. Connected to this is the conviction that truth is sometimes hidden or forbidden precisely because it threatens institutional power. Medieval practitioners recognized that Rome suppressed certain knowledge, not because that knowledge was false or evil, but because it threatened clerical authority. Contemporary practitioners similarly suspect that institutional powers suppress information, not because it's mistaken, but because revealing it would threaten those powers. This belief that suppression indicates significance, that what authorities most fear revealing matters most, shapes how contemporary practitioners interpret history and approach knowledge-seeking. Personal transformation through intense spiritual experience is valued over gradual accumulation of faith. Medieval forbidden rituals promised radical transformation of consciousness, encounter with something beyond ordinary experience. Contemporary spiritual practitioners similarly seek transformative experiences. They participate in meditation retreats, entheogenic ceremonies, ritual gatherings specifically designed to generate experiences they interpret as consciousness expanding or spiritually awakening. The desire for transformation through intense encounter, rather than through slow institutional processes, persists across centuries. Spirituality should be integrated with practical knowledge about the cosmos, nature, and human nature, rather than separated into purely theological domains. Medieval forbidden practices combined ritual with astronomical observation, herbal knowledge, understanding of human psychology. Contemporary spiritual practitioners similarly resist separating spirituality from embodied knowledge. Spiritual practice involves understanding ecology, psychology, cosmology, not merely accepting theological doctrine. This integration of practical and spiritual knowledge continues shaping how contemporary practitioners approach spirituality. Certain knowledge is understood as esoteric, not secret out of elitism or desire for power, but esoteric because it requires preparation and initiation to meaningfully understand. Medieval practitioners recognized that directly revealing sacred knowledge to unprepared individuals could cause harm or misunderstanding. The knowledge needed time to be properly understood. Contemporary esoteric communities maintain similar perspectives. Some knowledge should be shared gradually, with preparation, to those genuinely committed to understanding. This contrasts with contemporary impulses toward democratization of all information. These values create genuine tensions with other contemporary values. Democratic principles suggest all knowledge should be publicly accessible. Yet esoteric traditions suggest some knowledge requires initiation. Some contemporary practitioners emphasize accessibility and public sharing of knowledge previously kept secret. Others maintain traditional emphasis on initiation and graduated revelation. This tension between democratic impulses and esoteric traditions remains unresolved and likely unresolvable. These core values position their holders in particular relationships to authority. Practitioners valuing direct experience over institutional authorization naturally maintain skepticism toward institutional mediation. They question authorities' claims to exclusive access to truth. They resist institutional control over spirituality. This skepticism towards centralized authority, this questioning of institutional legitimacy, runs through medieval forbidden practices and continues characterizing contemporary esoteric spirituality. The most significant legacy may be less about specific rituals or cosmologies than about this fundamental orientation toward spirituality. An orientation that has proven resilient across centuries. That continues inspiring practitioners today. That continues existing in tension with centralized institutional approaches to spirituality and authority. The specific practices evolve and transform. The fundamental stance that certain knowledge is sacred, that truth sometimes requires courage to preserve, that direct experience matters more than institutional approval. This orientation survives, and it's alive today in how people approach spirituality, how they relate to authority, how they understand their own spiritual seeking. This orientation emerged from medieval people facing institutional suppression. It persists today because it addresses genuine needs and convictions that institutional spirituality often fails to meet. Consider what the mere existence of medieval forbidden practices reveals about human nature and spirituality itself. These practices didn't emerge from nowhere. They emerged from genuine human spiritual needs. They thrived despite persecution because people found them profoundly meaningful. They influenced subsequent traditions because they addressed something real that institutional religions sometimes fail to address. This historical reality tells us something fundamental about humans and how consciousness approaches the sacred. Humans require direct encounter with something they interpret as sacred. Institutional mediation, where priests or authorities control access to the divine, satisfies many people. Yet for others, direct experience seems essential. They need to encounter something they understand as sacred directly, without intermediaries. Medieval forbidden communities provided such encounters. Contemporary spiritual seekers continue pursuing such experiences through various means. This isn't primitive superstition or psychological delusion. It's genuine human hunger for direct connection to what they understand as ultimate reality. We require understanding ourselves within cosmic patterns, rather than merely within historical or theological frameworks. Medieval practitioners gathered under specific stars, conducted ceremonies aligned with celestial events, understood themselves as participating in vast cosmic processes. Contemporary practitioners seeking meaning often similarly desire cosmological understanding. They want to know not just what happened historically, but where humanity fits within larger patterns: cosmic, ecological, temporal. Institutional religions emphasizing salvation history sometimes fail to address this cosmic dimension of human meaning-making. We need communities of genuine peers rather than hierarchical mediation. Medieval forbidden communities sometimes practiced radical equality despite feudal society's hierarchy. Contemporary spiritual communities often similarly emphasize peer relationships rather than hierarchical authority. People hunger for communities where authentic connection occurs, where genuine dialogue happens, where members relate as equals rather than superiors and subordinates. Institutional religions organized hierarchically don't necessarily satisfy this hunger. The very persecution of forbidden practices testifies to their power and appeal. Institutions don't typically invest resources, suppressing things that don't matter or attract significant followings. The Church pursued these practices so relentlessly precisely because they mattered. They attracted people. They offered something compelling. The intensity of persecution reveals the intensity of appeal. That humans repeatedly develop esoteric, initiatory, experiential forms of spirituality, despite institutional opposition, suggests something fundamental about consciousness itself. Whenever institutional control loosens enough, these forms re-emerge. This recurrence across centuries and cultures suggests they're not anomalies but expressions of something persistent in human nature. We seem genuinely driven toward mystery, toward hidden knowledge, toward transformative experience, toward communities based on shared understanding rather than imposed hierarchy. Understanding medieval forbidden practices isn't merely historical exercise. It's window into persistent dimensions of human spirituality that emerge whenever institutional control weakens. The specific forms change. The fundamental patterns recur. Medieval practitioners and contemporary seekers, separated by centuries, share profound structural similarities in what they seek spiritually, why institutional frameworks sometimes fail them, and what alternatives they create when institutional control permits. The forbidden practices never disappeared because what they offered never stopped mattering. They emerged from real needs. They persisted through impossible circumstances because people found them genuinely meaningful. They continue today in various forms because those same needs continue. Understanding them tells us something true about ourselves, about what we genuinely need, about what spirituality truly involves, about why certain human impulses prove resilient enough to survive institutional opposition. We have journeyed through centuries of darkness, through hidden gathering places and secret knowledge transmission systems. We have traced the paradox at the heart of medieval suppression, that the very institutions most dedicated to erasing forbidden practices actually created the primary archive, documenting what they wanted forgotten. Rome's persecutors, with their meticulous records and systematic documentation, became the persecuted's historians. The machinery designed for elimination inadvertently preserved evidence of what it pursued. Let us gather the threads we've traced and see the full picture assembled from its fragmented pieces. We began in medieval Europe's layered spiritual landscape, where official Christianity coexisted with practices rooted in pre-Christian traditions. For centuries, this accommodation functioned. Priests tolerated or participated in rituals Rome would later declare anathema. Common people lived simultaneously within church-sanctioned spirituality and ancient practices their families had maintained across generations. This wasn't heresy. It was practical coexistence between competing spiritual systems occupying the same cultural spaces. Then came the shift. Around the 11th century, Rome recognized that its monopoly on spiritual authority was fracturing. Schisms divided Christendom. Heretical movements offered alternatives. Local practices undermined central control. The Church's response was categorical: uniformity or damnation. No more tolerance for regional variation. No more accommodation of pre-Christian elements. Practices that had been quietly overlooked for centuries were suddenly forbidden, heretical, worthy of prosecution. The Church's greatest miscalculation was believing prohibition alone would erase these practices. Instead, prohibition transformed them into symbols of resistance and sources of profound meaning for those who continued them secretly. Forbidden practices thrived through sophisticated adaptation. Large ceremonies contracted into family gatherings. Esoteric knowledge embedded itself in poetic language and artistic symbolism. Organized networks developed compartmentalized structures, preventing complete exposure if individual members were captured. Communities preserved knowledge through oral transmission, architectural encoding, and strategic preservation within monastic libraries. The very persecution that was supposed to eliminate these practices forced them to evolve, becoming more resilient, more carefully hidden, more capable of surviving institutional assault. Monasteries became unexpected repositories of forbidden knowledge. These institutions created to enforce orthodoxy instead became archives of suppressed practices. Monks, possessing literacy and access to ancient texts, made deliberate choices to preserve what Rome wanted erased. Some participated in forbidden practices themselves. Others recognized that destroying knowledge contradicted their vocation as keepers of learning. The paradox deepened. The institution most central to church power became a sanctuary for the knowledge the church hunted. The Inquisition represented institutional sophistication turned towards systematic persecution. It developed surveillance networks, interrogation protocols, and information systems designed specifically for identifying and eliminating targeted practices. The apparatus was remarkably effective. Communities were disrupted, networks were fragmented, texts were destroyed, yet complete elimination proved impossible. The practices had already become distributed and resilient enough to survive even sophisticated institutional pressure. Individual communities might be destroyed, but the broader network persisted. As medieval certainties crumbled under Renaissance intellectual forces, the conditions sustaining absolute suppression gradually loosened. Classical texts recovered from monasteries legitimated interest in pre-Christian knowledge. Protestant Reformation fragmented Rome's authority. Geographic expansion exposed Europeans to spiritual traditions impossible to categorize as simply heretical. Intellectual authority distributed beyond purely theological frameworks. In this opening space, practices that had been utterly forbidden began emerging into relative visibility. They didn't suddenly become acceptable everywhere, but they became possible in ways medieval suppression had made impossible. Bridge figures risked everything to gradually increase visibility of forbidden knowledge. Renaissance mages, published on topics previous generations couldn't have dared discuss openly. Monastic communities made accessible texts they had protected through centuries of danger. Intellectuals discovered new philosophical languages, allowing discussion of concepts that would have been immediately condemned in theological terms. Slowly, carefully, strategically, forbidden practices and knowledge moved from absolute secrecy toward relative visibility. Through all of this transformation and persecution and gradual emergence, what persisted was not necessarily the specific rituals in their original forms. What persisted was a fundamental spiritual orientation, the conviction that direct experience matters more than institutional authorization, that certain knowledge is worth preserving despite opposition. That truth sometimes requires courage to maintain, that communities of genuine peers possess more authentic value than hierarchical institutions, that spirituality should integrate practical knowledge about the cosmos rather than remaining purely theological. This orientation emerged from medieval people facing institutional suppression. It persists today in how contemporary spiritual practitioners approach their seeking, how they relate to authority, how they understand their own role as preservers and transmitters of knowledge and practice. The specific traditions evolve and transform. The fundamental stance remains recognizable across centuries. This isn't a story of good versus evil, or rebels versus tyrants. It's a complex historical reality where both institutional Christianity and forbidden practices embodied genuine values and addressed genuine needs. Both shaped the other. Persecution forced forbidden practices to become more sophisticated. Resistance forced institutions to become more powerful and controlling. Neither can be simply condemned or celebrated. Both reflected genuine human commitments. Yet one observation emerges from our exploration. Certain human spiritual needs and impulses proved too fundamental to be permanently eliminated through institutional opposition. Even opposition as sustained and thorough as medieval persecution, people continued seeking direct spiritual experience. Communities continued forming around shared understanding. Knowledge continued being preserved and transmitted. Despite everything, the forbidden practices survived, transformed, hidden, evolved, but persistent. That persistence itself speaks to something essential in human nature and human spirituality. Medieval people facing institutional suppression aren't entirely alien to us. Their circumstances differed radically from contemporary life, yet fundamental human patterns they embodied continue today. Understanding how those patterns operated historically illuminates how they operate now. The forbidden practices matter not as historical curiosity, but as window into persistent human dynamics that remain relevant across centuries. Institutional attempts to suppress knowledge and practice continue in various forms. The mechanisms differ. State power operates differently than medieval church authority. Scientific institutions wield different forms of legitimacy than theological authority. Yet the pattern persists. Institutions attempting to control what information circulates, what practices are permitted, what understanding is acceptable. Understanding how medieval suppression worked historically offers insight into how contemporary institutional control operates. We see how surveillance systems create paranoia, how accusations can weaponize communities against themselves, how prohibition paradoxically increases appeal, how determining what constitutes legitimate knowledge versus forbidden knowledge concentrates power. Many contemporary spiritual seekers and practitioners feel oppressed by dominant institutional narratives in ways paralleling medieval suppression. Whether the oppression comes from materialist scientific authority, dismissing spiritual experience as delusion, from institutional religious traditions offering spirituality the seeker finds inauthentic, or from state power restricting certain practices, the experience of feeling spiritually marginalized or persecuted resonates with historical memory of medieval forbidden practices. Understanding how people in the past created resilient alternative practices, how they transmitted knowledge under conditions of persecution, how they maintained communities despite institutional pressure, These historical examples offer practical and psychological models for contemporary resistance and authentic spiritual practice. The documentary's exploration of hidden knowledge and forbidden practices illuminates contemporary suspicions about what authorities aren't telling us, what has been systematically erased from histories, what truths are kept hidden. We must be careful here. Understanding how historical erasure actually occurred helps distinguish between plausible concerns and unfounded paranoia. Medieval suppression was real. Texts were genuinely destroyed. Communities were genuinely persecuted. Institutional erasure actually happened. Yet not every official narrative inconsistency indicates conspiracy. Not every absence from historical records indicates systematic suppression. Historical understanding should make us thoughtful about institutional claims and careful in evaluating evidence, not credulous toward every suggestion of hidden truth. The medieval emphasis on direct experience over institutional mediation resonates powerfully with contemporary desires for authentic, unmediated access to truth and spiritual experience. Contemporary people similarly hunger for direct encounter rather than mediated access. They seek first-hand knowledge rather than accepting institutional interpretations. They desire spiritual experience they interpret as genuine rather than accepting doctrinal claims about what spirituality should involve. This contemporary hunger parallels medieval forbidden practitioners' conviction that direct experience held more value than institutional authorization. The desire for authenticity, for directness, for unmediated encounter, this seems to be a persistent human need. The concept of forbidden knowledge itself carries particular cultural resonance today. Many people sense that certain truths are forbidden, certain questions aren't asked, certain possibilities aren't explored. They feel that dominant narratives suppress alternative understandings. Whether or not specific suspicions are accurate, the sense that knowledge is restricted and certain truths are hidden reflects genuine human experience of institutional gatekeeping. Understanding what actually constitutes forbidden knowledge in historical context, how suppression genuinely operated, what was actually hidden, what survived despite efforts to erase it, helps us think more carefully about contemporary claims regarding hidden knowledge. Historical understanding doesn't automatically validate contemporary conspiracy theories, but it does suggest that institutional suppression is real enough to warrant careful investigation rather than dismissal. The ultimate value of exploring medieval forbidden practices lies in illuminating fundamental human patterns. We see how power operates through control of information and legitimacy. We see how knowledge transmission occurs through multiple channels beyond official institutions. We see how communities resist suppression through adaptation and resilience. We see how spirituality persists despite institutional opposition. We see what human beings genuinely need: direct experience, authentic community, meaningful knowledge, and what happens when institutions fail to provide these needs. We see that humans will create alternatives when institutional frameworks become suffocating. Medieval forbidden practices reveal that institutional power, however overwhelming, cannot permanently eliminate fundamental human impulses. The practices emerged because people needed what they offered. They persisted because people valued what they provided. They evolved and survived because humans are capable of remarkable adaptation and resilience. Understanding this historical reality provides perspective on contemporary struggles. It suggests that what institutions condemn as forbidden sometimes persists because it genuinely matters to people. It suggests that communities can survive suppression through sophistication and solidarity. It suggests that human meaning-making refuses to be completely controlled by institutional authority. Understanding the past helps us understand ourselves and the dynamics shaping our present. We must conclude by acknowledging the fundamental limits of what we can know. Despite our extensive exploration of surviving evidence, despite assembling fragments and identifying patterns, substantial aspects of medieval forbidden practices remain genuinely unknown and may never be fully recovered. This isn't failure of historical method. It reflects the nature of historical knowledge itself. Some realities can be incompletely recovered, but never fully known, especially when those realities were deliberately hidden and partially destroyed. Consider what remains unknowable. We don't know the true extent of these practices. How many people actually participated? Were hundreds involved, or thousands? Did forbidden communities constitute marginal groups or substantial portions of medieval populations? The answer remains inaccessible. What evidence survived represents only what escaped destruction. The full scope of participation may have been vastly larger than fragmentary evidence suggests, or the evidence may actually represent the full extent of practice. We cannot determine which. The detailed nature of specific rituals remains inaccessible. We possess fragmentary descriptions. We can reconstruct elements. Yet the complete experience of participating in these ceremonies, what participants actually felt, what they genuinely understood themselves as experiencing, to what the rituals meant from inside the experience, rather than from external observation, this remains largely unknowable. We can imagine and reconstruct and make educated guesses. We cannot know with certainty. Someone who actually participated in a forbidden ritual ceremony possessed knowledge we can never fully access. The precise theological and cosmological worldviews practitioners held remain partially opaque. We know they rejected certain church doctrines. We know they held alternative understandings of spirituality and cosmos. Yet the complete philosophical frameworks guiding their practice remain partially hidden. Some texts were destroyed completely, taking their arguments with them. Some knowledge was transmitted orally and disappeared when the last practitioners died. We work with fragments. The complete systems remain inaccessible. We don't know how effective these practices actually were for participants. What transformation did practitioners genuinely feel they experienced? What did forbidden rituals deliver to people willing to risk death for participation? The answer was clearly something profound and meaningful. Yet the specific nature of that experience, what people genuinely underwent, what they genuinely felt themselves encountering, remains largely internal to their experience. We cannot fully enter what they experienced. The extent to which forbidden practices influenced broader medieval spirituality remains uncertain. Were these practices marginal expressions, pursued by small communities, while mainstream medieval Christianity continued largely unchanged? Or did forbidden practices, and their underlying orientation, influence medieval spirituality more broadly than surviving evidence suggests? Were there individuals who participated partially in forbidden practices while maintaining nominal church loyalty? How widespread was the tension between official Christianity and alternative spirituality? The answer remains partially unknowable. These unknowns aren't troubling merely because we desire complete information. They reflect something important. Certain human experiences and meanings remain fundamentally inaccessible to those outside them. This is particularly true for esoteric traditions. By their nature, they conceal their deepest dimensions. Even contemporary practitioners sometimes don't fully understand what they're participating in. The lived interior experience of initiation, of transformation, of encountering something participants interpreted as sacred, this remains partly inaccessible even to those living the experience. This irreducible mystery has genuine value. It preserves the genuine alterity of the past. It prevents false certainty about historical realities we can only partially recover. It honors the dignity of experiences and meanings that outsiders can never fully access. It maintains appropriate humility about the limits of historical knowledge. It respects those medieval practitioners by acknowledging that what they experienced remains partially beyond our comprehension. This documentary, despite its length and detail, necessarily leaves the audience with as many questions as answers. Not because the investigation failed, but because the subject itself is fundamentally mysterious in ways deserving respect. The full reality of what occurred in medieval darkness remains partially hidden. Some things were lost too completely. Some meanings were hidden too deeply. Some experiences were too alien to contemporary understanding. Perhaps that's exactly as it should be. We return to where we began, standing at the threshold of medieval darkness, aware now of the hidden life that thrived there, conscious of the institutional forces arrayed against it, yet ultimately understanding that the full reality of these forbidden ceremonies remains partially hidden still. That hiddenness isn't a failure of history. It's part of what these practices were: mysteries worth protecting, knowledge worth preserving even at tremendous cost, experiences worth seeking despite the risks. And in that hiddenness, they continue speaking to something fundamental in the human spirit, the conviction that certain truths are worth any cost. That direct experience of the sacred matters more than institutional approval, that some knowledge deserves to remain mysterious. The forbidden ceremonies of medieval Europe were erased by history, but they were never fully forgotten. And perhaps that persistence, that inability to erase something that truly matters to people, is the most important truth of all.